This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I gripped the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white. It was nearly 3 a.m, and I'd been driving alone for hours on a narrow dirt road with no streetlights. My eyes felt dry, and the only brightness came from my headlights bouncing off loose gravel and random patches of grass. The silence in my car seemed heavier than usual, and each minute felt longer than the last. I told myself I just needed to stay awake until I reached a main highway. There, I could find a gas station or a motel, anything that had people and lights. But at that moment, it felt like I was cut off from everything. When I saw something crouched on the side of the road, I thought I was hallucinating. I blinked a few times, but it didn't vanish. It stood out against the darkness, and its eyes reflected my headlights with a dull shine. I slowed down, bracing myself for a deer or coyote, yet it had a human shape. My stomach lurched when I realized it wasn't an animal. I jerked the wheel to the right, trying not to hit whatever it was. The car swayed and kicked up dust. My seatbelt locked, and I heard my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Gravel pinged against the undercarriage. I fought the urge to slam the brakes, convinced that sudden braking might cause me to spin out or get stuck. Finally, I eased the car to a stop on the shoulder. My arms shook, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. I couldn't see anything behind me except darkness. Then I leaned forward and peered through the windshield. The figure was no longer on the exact spot where I'd first seen it, but I could still make out a faint outline further back along the road. It had moved slightly, though I didn't recall seeing it move. I tried to calm my breathing. I told myself it might be someone who needed help, maybe a hitchhiker, but something felt off. I swallowed hard, turned off the engine, and reached for a flashlight in the glove compartment. When I opened the door, the night air hit my face like a slap. It was cold and still. The dirt crunched under my shoes when I stepped out. My heart was pounding, and my temples throbbed with each beat. I flicked on the flashlight and walked around to check my front bumper, worried that I might have scraped against a rock. I squatted down, felt the metal, and brushed aside some dust. Then I stood and aimed the flashlight toward the spot where I'd seen the figure. I wanted to call out, "Hey, do you need anything?" But my throat felt tight. The shape was out there, just beyond the reach of the beam. I kept the light focused in that direction, and I took a few slow steps forward, trying not to spook whoever or whatever it was. I heard a faint shuffle on the dirt behind me. I spun around, shining the beam across the trunk of my car and past the rear tires. Nothing. I listened, standing there with my mouth slightly open, feeling my breath rasp against my dry lips. Then I turned back, but the figure had inched closer. It stood just off the shoulder in the tall grass. I couldn't see a face, but I saw something like a pair of eyes reflecting the light again. My stomach twisted. I felt lightheaded. I wanted to ask who it was, but I couldn't form the words. My heart hammered so loud I could hear it in my ears. The figure didn't speak or move in a normal way. It just seemed to glide forward when I wasn't looking. I backed away until I reached the car's hood. Then I hopped inside, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands fumbled as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered at first, and I cursed under my breath. Finally, it roared to life. The headlights washed over the road ahead, and for a second, I thought I saw the figure a few feet closer than before. I revved the engine and tried to pull back onto the dirt road. The wheels spun in place. The car lurched, but it didn't move forward. I realized the rear wheels had sunk into a shallow trench. I pressed the gas again, but the car didn't budge. A wave of panic surged through me, and my mouth went dry. I glanced at the side mirror, half expecting to see that thing standing inches away, but the mirror showed only darkness. Then I heard a thump on the rear passenger side, like someone tapping the door with their knuckles. I clenched the steering wheel again, sweating despite the chill. My lungs felt tight. I put the car in reverse, hoping to rock it free. The tires spun, and the engine whined. Dust filled the air behind me, but I didn't move more than a foot. At that point, I swore under my breath. I took a moment to breathe and forced myself to think. I decided I'd try to get out and push, or maybe put some rocks under the tires for traction. But the idea of leaving the car again made my skin crawl. I looked toward the passenger window. The glass reflected my own face, pale and wide-eyed. Then a flicker of movement flashed behind that reflection. Something outside pressed against the window, just at the edge of my vision. I jumped and nearly shouted. When I turned my head to look directly, nothing was there. My pulse hammered in my neck. I found myself hitting the horn out of desperation. The sound cut through the night like a wounded animal's cry. It echoed across the empty fields. I kept honking, hoping it would scare away whoever was out there. My arms felt heavy. My breathing was ragged. I tried reversing again. This time the car jolted backward with a sudden jerk, and I used that momentum to steer slightly to the left. The rear tires popped out of the trench, and I lurched forward in my seat. I saw dust billowing in the headlights. I exhaled in relief and shifted into drive. The car moved, wobbled, but kept rolling. I pressed the pedal harder than I meant to and almost swerved. I managed to straighten the wheel, and soon I was moving steadily down the road. I tried not to look in the mirrors too much, but every few seconds I felt compelled to glance. My eyes scanned the edges of the road, searching for the outline of that shape. At one point I thought I saw it a dozen yards behind me, but it didn't seem to be running. It kept a slow, steady pace, always at the edge of my sight. I felt my skin prickling. The hair on my arms stood up. My foot pressed the gas pedal down, urging the car to speed up. Small rocks pinged against the underbody, and I gritted my teeth every time I felt the car bounce over a bump. I was afraid that any moment I'd hit another soft patch and get stuck again. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. Time felt strange. My eyes kept flicking to the darkness outside, trying to spot any sign of movement. The road curved slightly. I gripped the wheel and eased into the turn. The headlights swept across the field, revealing only low grass and patches of dirt. Then I spotted a reflection, those eyes again. They were on my left side, but farther away. The figure glided along, never looking like it was running, yet it kept pace. I pressed harder on the accelerator. The engine whined in protest. I felt a jolt of frustration, fear, and anger mixed together in my gut. I kept thinking I'd left it behind, but it showed up again like it was toying with me. Then I felt the tires finally grip a firmer section of road. The car accelerated with more stability, and I noticed the faint outline of a proper highway up ahead. The dirt road was about to merge into asphalt. I saw a small sign that indicated a main route. My throat unclenched a bit. I told myself I just needed to reach that highway. There might be traffic or at least streetlights. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a hint of hope. The figure seemed to fall farther back. I couldn't see it in my side mirrors anymore. Part of me wanted to slow down and check, but my survival instinct took over. I stayed on the gas until the front tires hit the asphalt with a small bump. The relief was immediate, but my body was still shaking. I turned onto the highway, noticing a series of lights in the distance, maybe a town or a rest stop. I rubbed my neck with one hand, trying to relax the muscles. My shirt was damp with sweat. I forced myself to take a few steadying breaths. The tension lingered in my chest. My mind raced with questions. Who or what was that? Why didn't it speak or come any closer when I was watching? Then my fear spiked again. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see it standing in the middle of the road behind me. But there was nothing. I drove on, trying not to go too fast, but every fiber of me wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and that dirt road. A few minutes later, I saw a small gas station sign flickering in the distance. I pulled in, parked by one of the pumps, and switched off the engine. Everything felt surreal. The overhead lights were glaringly bright, and the smell of fuel was strong. The contrast was overwhelming, and I found myself just sitting there for a moment, trying to calm down. My hands trembled, and I realized I had been gripping the steering wheel so long that my fingers felt stiff. I looked around, checking all the angles. This place was quiet, but it had a payphone and a small convenience store shack that was closed. I took another breath, then got out and stretched. The night air here felt less oppressive. I considered calling someone, but I wasn't sure who would believe me. I also thought about the possibility that I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew I had seen something. I could still feel that sensation of eyes on me. I kept scanning the edges of the station's lights, but the darkness beyond looked empty. I refueled the car in record time, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Once I had enough gas, I got back in the driver's seat. My head hurt, and my muscles were sore. I turned the ignition, and the engine hummed. I half expected a shape to appear in my headlights, but the lot stayed empty. As I drove away, the wide highway stretched out in front of me, with the faint glow of distant towns on the horizon. I kept the radio off so I could listen for anything unusual. My heart rate gradually slowed, though I still felt on edge. Several times, I glanced behind me, worried I might see a pair of reflective eyes trailing in the distance. But the road remained quiet, with no cars or mysterious figures. After about half an hour, I passed a motel sign. I made a split-second decision and pulled off the highway, heading for the motel's parking lot. I wanted to rest and make sure I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe a few hours of sleep would help me think clearly. I parked near the entrance and walked toward the office. Every step felt heavy. My nerves were frayed, and I felt drained. I reached for the door handle and paused. I looked back at my car, scanning the darkness. No movement, no shape. Inside the office, the clerk was half asleep, but I got a room key without much trouble. As I walked to my room, I kept looking around, expecting that presence to appear. It never did. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows twice, then threw myself on the bed without bothering to pull down the sheets. My heart was still pounding, and my mind kept replaying the sight of that crouched figure. My eyes burned, and my body ached. Sleep came slowly, but eventually, exhaustion won out. When I woke a few hours later, the sun was rising. I left the motel and continued my trip. The memory of that figure followed me. My shoulders tensed each time I glanced at the rearview mirror. I didn't see it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, somewhere in the corners of my mind. Whenever I think about that night, I remember the cold air against my skin, the grit of the dirt under my shoes, and the soft thump against the car window. I remember how my heart felt like it would burst from my chest. I can't explain what I saw, and I hate not having answers. Even now, I sometimes relive those moments. The sense of isolation, the reflection of those eyes, the way it seemed to get closer whenever I looked away. That night showed me that there are things out there that we can't always understand. And I know I'll never forget the feeling of seeing that figure on the side of the road, staring at me in the darkness, almost close enough to touch. I remember that night because the rain was so loud it felt like the roof might cave in. I was sitting on my couch in the living room, scrolling aimlessly through social media on my phone. The lights were off because I liked the dim glow of the screen against the darkness. I had the curtains drawn, but they were thin, and the faint outside light sometimes showed shapes on the other side of the fabric. I wasn't really paying attention to anything around me until I caught a glimpse of a figure standing on my small front porch. At first, I thought it was a trick of the water streaming down the glass or some reflection. Then I realized it wasn't moving at all, but it had a clear human outline. My throat went tight, and my stomach clenched. I locked my phone and tried to listen for any sound coming from the porch, but the rain drowned out everything. I stayed very still, trying to decide what to do. My heart thudded in my chest, and my palms got damp. I didn't hear footsteps or knocking. It was just standing there, that shape. I stood up slowly, then took a step toward the window. I didn't turn on any lamps because I was afraid that if there was actually someone out there, they would see me too clearly. I kept the curtains closed but tried to peek through a gap at the edge. In the dark, I could see rain hitting the porch floor. Through the water, there was a silhouette. It appeared tall, with shoulders that seemed hunched forward. I couldn't see a face, but I thought maybe the person was wearing a hood. I thought it might be a neighbor seeking shelter or someone looking for help. But something in my gut told me this felt off. The figure wasn't moving at all. There was no attempt to knock or call out. I felt a growing tension in my neck and shoulders. I backed away from the window and reached for my phone again. I checked my camera feed because I had a cheap security camera installed outside. It wasn't top-notch, but it should have triggered a motion alert if someone was close to the door. I opened the app and saw no recent notifications. That seemed impossible if a person was really there. I took a deep breath and walked down the short hallway to the front door. I pressed my ear against it, trying to pick up any sounds. Water dripped off the gutters, and the wind occasionally whipped the rain against the door. But I didn't hear breathing or rustling. I wondered if I was imagining things. Slowly, I looked through the peephole. The porch light was off, so I couldn't see much, but I saw no shape there. It looked empty, just wet concrete and the yard beyond it. My entire body felt tense, and my mind was racing. I took a step back from the door, unsure of what to believe. I went back to the living room and looked through the gap in the curtain again. The figure was there. It was definitely the same outline, standing in the same spot. My pulse pounded in my ears. My first thought was that my peephole was somehow not giving me the same angle. I considered that maybe the figure was off to one side, but that wouldn't explain why I couldn't see it at all. I decided to check the porch in person. The idea made my skin crawl, but I felt I had no choice. I slipped on some shoes, grabbed a small flashlight, and braced myself. When I opened the front door, a blast of cold, wet air hit me in the face. Rain poured onto the porch in thick sheets. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The beam revealed puddles, the porch rail, and my empty driveway. No one was there. My heart was beating so fast that my hands shook. I moved the flashlight slowly, double-checking every corner. The wind howled through the trees, and water trickled along the edges of the porch. I didn't see footprints or anything that would indicate a person standing there. After a minute, I went back in, dripping water on the entryway floor. I locked the door immediately and pressed my back against it, feeling my heartbeat reverberate through my body. I returned to the living room to check the curtain again. The figure stood there, in the same place, as if it had never moved. I felt a surge of panic. My pulse throbbed in my temples, and I swallowed hard. My breath came in short bursts, and my skin felt clammy. I told myself to calm down and focus on basic details. I tried to note the shape's height, the width of its shoulders, the position of its arms. From what I could see, it looked like the arms were at its sides, motionless. I couldn't see any movement in the torso or head. I wanted to shout something, but I was afraid of what might happen if I did. I turned on the overhead light in the living room, hoping that maybe the extra illumination would remove any illusions. But that made it even clearer. From the inside, I could see the silhouette behind the curtain, still there, not reacting. Rain continued to pound the roof and windows. Each gust of wind rattled the window frames, making me flinch. I grabbed my phone and considered calling the police. My hesitation came from the fact that the figure vanished whenever I checked the porch directly, and I knew the security camera didn't record anything. I worried I would sound unstable if I said, "I see someone outside through my curtain, but not through my peephole, and my camera shows nothing." Still, my fear was real. My hands were shaking, and my stomach felt twisted in knots. I decided to try the camera feed again, so I walked over to the small desk in the corner and angled my phone for a better signal. The footage was live, streaming from my front yard. Raindrops slid across the lens, but the porch looked empty. It was just wet, dark, and lifeless. The camera feed contradicted what my eyes saw at the window. I switched to recording mode, hoping to catch a live shot. Then I tiptoed back to the curtain. I pulled the edge open a bit more. The figure stood in the same spot. No motion, no sign that it noticed me. I raised my phone, aiming it at the window, and tapped the screen to focus. On my phone's screen, I could see only the living room's reflection in the glass. I couldn't see the figure on my phone at all, only with my naked eye. That made me feel lightheaded. I tried to push the curtain aside a few more inches to get a clearer view. My heart pounded as I did this, but when I did, the silhouette seemed to vanish. I moved the curtain back, and it reappeared. It was in the exact same place, as if my perspective determined its visibility. My hands felt sweaty, and my pulse was racing. It was like my eyes were seeing something that my camera and peephole couldn't detect. My legs felt weak, and my neck was tense. I stepped away, deciding to return to the front door with the flashlight one more time. This time, I moved faster. I opened the door and shone the light on the porch, swinging the beam from left to right. Rain splashed on my shoes, and water dripped from the roof onto my shoulders. I saw nothing but the wet porch floor. My heart still raced, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I took a few steps onto the porch, scanning the yard. Streetlights were on, but the storm reduced visibility. I saw no people, no signs of movement beyond the branches swaying. My breathing was shaky. The cold rain seeped through my socks. After about a minute, I went back inside. I locked the door again and flipped the deadbolt. I wiped my face with my sleeve, wiping away rain and sweat. Back in the living room, I lifted the curtain slightly. The silhouette was back. My insides felt like they were tightening into a knot. My forehead was damp with sweat, and I couldn't stop blinking from the stress. I let the curtain drop. My mind was spinning. I tried to think logically. Could it be some strange reflection? Could it be a shape from the trees outside? But there was no big plant or piece of furniture out there that might cast that shape. Also, It appeared consistently in the same spot, only when I looked through the curtain. That knowledge weighed on me like a heavy load on my chest. I sat on the couch and stared at the curtain. I tapped my foot on the floor, feeling the vibration travel up my leg. I wondered if I should call a friend and ask them to come over, but it was past midnight, and the storm was strong. No one would want to drive in that weather for something I couldn't even prove. I looked at the time. It was past 1 in the morning, and I hadn't moved beyond the living room and front door areas. Every time the thunder cracked, I jumped a little. I felt like an intruder in my own home, pinned down by that silent figure outside. After another 10 minutes of pacing and occasionally peeking, I decided I'd cover the window completely. I pulled a thick blanket from a closet and used pushpins to secure it over the curtain rod. I made sure there were no gaps. The moment I did that, I felt a slight relief, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond that barrier. The rain kept pouring, and the wind made the house creak. I felt watched even though I couldn't see anything. My shoulders were sore from being so tense. My nerves were on edge. I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV. I put the volume low, but the noise didn't help much. My thoughts kept racing. I turned off the TV again, got up, and checked my phone's camera feed once more. Still no motion detected. I considered walking around the outside of the house to see if anyone might be lurking, but the idea made my chest tighten. I was too scared to risk it. Instead, I walked to every window in the house and looked outside. Rain hammered all the glass, but I saw nothing unusual. No footprints in the mud, no shadows crossing the yard. Only the front window had shown that figure, and I'd covered it with a blanket. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I sat on the couch, phone in hand, and let my eyes close, though every crack of thunder made me startle. My body was worn out from adrenaline. I dozed off for a while. When I opened my eyes, it was almost dawn. The rain had weakened to a drizzle. The blanket was still over the window, and everything was quiet except for occasional drops hitting the rooftop. My heart rate had settled, but the unease returned when I remembered what had happened. As sunlight began to filter through, I finally got the courage to remove the blanket. I did it slowly, holding my breath. The window showed a wet front porch and a gray sky. No shadow, no silhouette. I didn't see any sign that someone had been there. I pressed my face close to the glass, peering outside. The yard was empty except for puddles. I looked for footprints but saw only random splashes of water. I felt a chill run down my back as I wondered what I had really seen. I checked my security camera app again, hoping for some recording that would confirm I wasn't imagining it. There were no alerts besides the heavy rain. I stepped onto the porch one last time, letting the drizzle hit my jacket. The air smelled of wet concrete and damp grass. The only sounds were droplets falling from the eaves. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the memory of that shape behind the curtain. I felt drained, as if I hadn't slept at all. I just kept thinking about how it was never visible except through that thin fabric, and how it never moved an inch. To this day, I have no explanation. That night still makes my chest feel tight when I think about it. The image of that figure stands out in my memory. It was so clearly human-like in shape, but so wrong in its stillness. It didn't knock or speak or do anything except appear behind my curtain whenever I looked. Then it vanished when I tried to confront it directly. I've never experienced anything like that before or since. After that, I replaced the curtains with thicker ones, and I got a better security system. But I still have nights when a storm hits, and I switch off my phone, turn on every light, and avoid looking outside. I never want to see a shape like that again. I still remember the first night I heard the crying through the wall. It was around 2 in the morning, and I'd just moved into this small house on a quiet street a few days earlier. I was lying in bed, half awake, when I heard a muffled sob. At first I thought it was the wind or some animal outside, but it had a distinct human quality. It sounded like someone weeping, catching their breath between sobs. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and listened. The sound came from somewhere to my left, which meant the abandoned house next door. During the day, several neighbors had told me that house had been empty for years. They said the previous owners left suddenly, and nobody had moved in since. As far as everyone knew, the place was locked up tight, windows boarded from inside. I had even walked around that house earlier, just to check if it posed any security issues. The yard was overgrown, and the doors looked sealed. There was no sign of recent activity. But that night, I heard someone crying from that direction. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. My heart pounded, and my hands felt clammy. My first instinct was to get out of bed, but I was still exhausted from unpacking. I convinced myself I might be mistaken. I told myself it could have been a cat wailing or some odd echo from down the street. I tried to sleep again, but my mind kept returning to that sound. Eventually, I drifted off, but I felt uneasy. The next day, I asked a neighbor, an older woman who had lived there for decades, if anyone had broken in next door. She looked surprised and shook her head. She insisted nobody went near that house, that it was deserted. I felt a twist in my stomach but tried not to dwell on it. I had my own tasks to handle, like organizing my furniture and updating the utilities. That second night, the crying started again at almost the same time. I was in the living room watching TV, and it came through the wall as a faint but distinct sobbing. I muted the television and listened carefully. My skin prickled. I pressed my ear to the wall, and I heard a woman's voice, though the words were not clear. It sounded like she was in pain or grieving. My chest tightened because I felt helpless. I had no idea if she needed help or if I was dealing with something else. After about 10 minutes, it stopped abruptly, just like the first time. I realized my hands were shaking. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I walked over to the empty house, checking if there was any open window or door. The front door was locked with a rusted padlock. The windows were covered by old boards. The yard was full of weeds, and the back fence was rotting. I went around, peered into gaps in the boards, but saw only darkness inside. I called out, "Hello?" but got no response. I tried tapping on one of the boarded windows, half expecting someone to answer. Only silence greeted me. I returned home feeling uneasy. My gut told me something was off. That night, I prepared by turning off all my lights and waiting in silence. When the clock showed almost 2 in the morning, the sobs began. They were stronger than before, echoing through the stillness. The hairs on my arms stood up, and my throat felt dry. I decided I needed proof, or at least some way to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I took my phone and hit record, aiming it at the wall. The crying continued for about 10 minutes. Once it stopped, I played back the audio. It was there, faint but real. I felt a wave of relief that I wasn't imagining it, but also a surge of fear because I had no explanation. I spoke to a few more neighbors the next day, even played them the recording. They all seemed perplexed. One man suggested a raccoon or some stray dog might be making noises, but everyone else admitted it did sound like a person crying. Nobody had an answer for who could be in that locked-up, vacant house. I mentioned calling the police, but another neighbor shrugged and said they had done that years ago when they heard strange noises. The police found no one inside, and the matter was dropped. On the fourth night, I'd had enough. The crying started right on schedule. I threw on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and walked outside to check the perimeter. The neighborhood was quiet, and the sky was clear. I reached the side of the abandoned house where my bedroom wall was closest to theirs. I listened carefully. I could still hear the muffled sobbing, though it was quieter outside. I tried shining my flashlight between the boards, squinting to see any movement. Nothing. My pulse was hammering in my chest. I felt an urge to break a window or find a way in, but I worried about trespassing or injuring myself. The boards looked old and splintered, and there could be nails or broken glass. I returned to my house, more rattled than ever. The crying cut off abruptly again, leaving me with a sense of emptiness. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling. By morning, I decided to call the local police department. I told them about the nightly crying, the vacant property, and my concerns that someone might be stuck inside. They arrived later that afternoon. 2 officers knocked on the front door of the house, tried to peer through the windows, and circled around the back. Then they came to my place to let me know there was no sign of forced entry. They said the house looked locked up. They assured me it might be pipes or wind, and advised me to call again if I saw any actual intruder. That didn't ease my anxiety. That very night, I woke up just before 2, as if my body had learned the schedule of the sobs. I listened in bed, and right on time, the crying started. It sounded desperate. I felt my hands gripping the sheets. My heart pounded. I wondered if it was a ghost or a person hidden inside. My mind jumped to all kinds of possibilities. I decided I needed to see for myself. So on the next night, after the sobbing stopped, I waited another hour and then snuck onto the property with a crowbar, feeling both terrified and determined. Prying open one of the back windows took more effort than I expected. The boards creaked loudly, and my arms strained. I kept looking over my shoulder, worried someone might catch me. Finally, I managed to pull one board loose, and I climbed inside. The smell hit me first, stale air and dust. My flashlight showed old furniture draped in sheets and cobwebs hanging from the corners. The floor creaked under my weight. I felt chills running through my body. The place was silent except for my own breathing. I moved through the rooms, checking corners, calling out quietly, "Hello?" My voice echoed. No reply. I found nothing unusual until I reached a bedroom near the wall shared with my own house. Inside, the floor was mostly bare, with peeling wallpaper and a few old boxes. In one corner, there was a makeshift pile of blankets and trash, indicating someone might have used the space recently. My pulse quickened. I leaned down, shining the flashlight on the blankets. They were filthy, covered in what looked like food stains. I called out, "Is anyone here?" My voice shook. For a moment I thought I heard a shuffle in the hallway. I froze, my body tensing up. I whispered, "Hello?" Again, but I heard nothing else. I spent another few minutes exploring, but I didn't find a person. There were no fresh footprints, no sign of forced entry from inside. It looked like someone might have camped there at some point, but I couldn't tell how long ago. I left through the same window, feeling uneasy. My clothes were covered in dust, and my arms trembled from the tension. That night, I stayed up until 2 again, waiting. Sure enough, the sobbing returned, just as miserable and haunting as before. I wanted to run back next door immediately, but I was too shaken. The memory of that silent house and the strange blankets rattled me. Instead, I wrote down everything I'd seen, trying to piece together the puzzle. After a few days, nothing changed. The sobbing kept happening, and every time I checked, there was no one. Finally, one night, I reached a breaking point. I grabbed my keys and a flashlight, marched outside, and forced my way into the house again through the same window. This time, I caught the sobbing in real time. I could hear it echoing in the dim interior. The sound seemed to come from a back hallway. My heart pounded as I followed the noise, stepping carefully on the creaky floorboards. I swung the flashlight beam ahead of me. Then I saw her, a woman crouched against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. Her hair was tangled and her clothes looked tattered and dirty. She was crying softly, rocking back and forth. I said, "Hey, are you okay?" My voice came out unsteady. She looked up at me with wide eyes. Her face was dirty, and she looked panicked. I lowered the flashlight, trying not to blind her. "Do you need help?" I asked. She mumbled something I couldn't catch, then told me to leave. I took a step forward, but she scrambled to her feet and darted down the hall. I ran after her, but she was fast, and the darkness made it hard to navigate. By the time I reached the next room, she was gone. I shone the flashlight around, searching corners and doorways. Nothing. My heart was hammering. My throat felt dry. I stayed there a few minutes, calling out, "Please wait, I'm not here to hurt you." No answer. Finally, I retreated to my own house, shaken. I didn't call the police immediately because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. I also realized she might be in trouble, and I didn't want to scare her away completely. Over the next few days, I decided to leave small items, bottles of water, some food, and an old blanket, near the back fence where the boards were loose. I didn't see or hear her, but I wanted her to know someone was concerned. Then, suddenly, the crying stopped. Each night, I waited at 2 in the morning, listening for the sobs, but the house stayed silent. A week passed, and the crying never returned. I asked around to see if anyone had spotted a woman leaving. Nobody had any information. The neighbors looked at me with confusion when I asked. I thought about reporting it to the authorities, but I had no evidence beyond my own experience in that brief encounter. Whenever I tried to explain, I got tangled in my words. People seemed skeptical. Eventually, I noticed that the items I'd left by the fence were gone. The area looked disturbed, like someone had taken them, so she must have moved on. The nights returned to their usual quiet, but my relief was mixed with guilt and worry. I'd never learned her story or found out why she was hiding there. I wondered if she was running from a situation or if she needed medical help. I might never know. Even now, when the wind blows late at night, I sometimes jolt awake, half expecting to hear those sobs. My new neighbors think I'm jumpy. The abandoned house remains locked, and nobody has shown interest in buying or fixing it. Every time I walk past, I remember the echo of her cries. I can't forget the sight of her crouched against that wall, eyes wide and frightened. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, but it still keeps me up at night. The idea that someone could be so close, crying for help, yet remain a mystery, haunts me. I still check the house's perimeter sometimes, looking for any sign that she returned. But it's always the same, quiet, boarded up, and empty. Or at least, that's how it looks from the outside. I remember the exact moment I first heard the voice call my name. I was running along a narrow path surrounded by tall grass, trying to clear my head. The sun was high, and there was almost no breeze. The air felt thick, and the only sounds I noticed were my own footsteps on the dirt and the occasional rustling of insects hidden in the grass. I chose this trail because it was remote and rarely used by other runners or hikers. That day, I just wanted solitude. But I ended up with something else entirely. I had jogged about half a mile when I got my first feeling that something was wrong. It was a simple sensation at the back of my neck, like I wasn't alone. I slowed my pace, looking around to confirm I had the trail to myself. No one was visible, and the grass on either side was motionless, except for minor movements caused by small creatures. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. I adjusted my headphones, but then I realized I wasn't wearing any that day. I had decided to run in silence. That realization hit me harder than I expected, because I knew the wind wasn't blowing enough to create strange sounds. I picked up my pace again, trying to focus on my breathing. But a few minutes later, I heard a faint whisper. It sounded like my own name, drawn out in a quiet, breathy voice. I froze mid-step, heart pounding so hard that my chest felt tight. I turned quickly, expecting to see another person, but the trail behind me was empty. The tall grass waved slightly near the edges, but not enough to suggest someone had just ducked behind it. My instincts told me to leave, but my curiosity held me in place. I listened closely, hearing nothing but the thump of my pulse in my ears. I decided to keep running, but I stayed more alert. Every few steps, I glanced left and right, scanning the thick grass for any sign of movement or a crouched figure. The heat seemed to amplify my paranoia, making my skin clammy. I felt sweat trickling down my back. My mouth was dry, and I regretted not bringing water. Then I heard it again, that whisper. It was a single word, my name. The sound was close, as though someone was speaking from an arm's length away. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around, nearly losing my balance in the dirt. Still, no one was there. My immediate thought was that someone might be messing with me. Maybe a friend knew I would be on this trail, but I had told no one about my plan for an afternoon run. I also considered an animal, but that made no sense. The voice was too clear, too human. My legs felt jittery, like they wanted me to run faster. I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the path ahead. Then I broke into a light jog again, not sure if I was running from or toward the voice. My heart rate rose, and I could feel my pulse in my neck. As I moved, I became hyper-aware of the environment. The grass on either side stood around chest height, but in some patches it reached my shoulders. I glanced at the ground to ensure there were no holes or rocks that might trip me up. The trail itself was narrow but visible, with patches of dirt and small stones. I realized my footfalls were louder than usual, maybe because I was more tense. The crunch of dirt under my shoes felt amplified in my ears. A few more minutes went by, and I started to think that maybe the whisper was in my head. I was tired and hot, and sometimes exhaustion plays tricks on the mind. I tried to lengthen my stride to get through the trail faster. Then I heard the whisper again, but this time it followed me, step for step. It repeated my name in the same tone, almost rhythmic. I began to sweat more. My scalp tingled with alarm. I stopped again, turned my head slowly to the left, and peered through the grass. I saw no shapes, only thin stalks and the ground beneath them. Then I turned to the right, and it was the same view. My pulse pounded in my ears, and my breathing became shallow. I thought about calling out, "Who's there?" but I feared what might respond. The whisper grew more frequent, like it was tracking me. I decided to try a short sprint to see if I could outrun it, so I forced myself into a faster run. My quads burned with the sudden change in speed, and the rocks on the trail forced me to watch each footstep. The whisper did not fade. It stayed consistent, as though it hovered at the same distance. I felt my skin crawl. My chest ached from breathing too hard. Within a few minutes, I realized that sprinting wasn't helping. My energy was draining. I slowed to a jog, then stopped entirely, hands on my knees, gulping air. Sweat dripped from my forehead and stung my eyes. My head swiveled around, scanning the grass. I felt claustrophobic, like the tall grass was closing in. There was no breeze, no rustling. Everything felt too still. I listened intently. The whisper called my name once more, very close. My heart hammered so hard that my temples throbbed. I shouted, "Where are you?" My voice sounded shaky. The whisper didn't answer in words. It just repeated my name softly, as if it was right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing. I swung my arms out, expecting to collide with something, but I only hit empty air. My breath came in ragged bursts. My shirt clung to my chest. I started backing away slowly, unsure of which direction to go. The path forward eventually led to a side trail that connected to a more populated area. I decided I would push through to that side trail, no matter how long it took. The next stretch of the run was agonizing. With each footstep, I expected to feel a hand grab my shoulder or see a figure burst from the grass. The whisper stayed at the same volume, which unnerved me. It didn't fade away, nor did it get louder. I had the unsettling impression that someone or something was walking parallel to me, just a few feet into the grass. Whenever I glanced in that direction, I saw no movement. The tension made my muscles ache. Finally, I spotted the fork in the trail ahead. It was just a small opening to the left, marked by a wooden stake. My body surged with adrenaline. I ran toward it, ignoring the slight pain in my ankles from uneven ground. The whisper stayed with me until I actually reached the offshoot. Then it lessened, like it was having trouble following. I chanced one more look over my shoulder. The grass behind me looked empty, no sign of a person. My entire body shook with relief, but I wasn't safe yet. I turned onto the side trail. It was wider, though not by much, and it eventually led to a dirt road that local residents sometimes used. As I moved farther away from the main path, the whisper faded. My breathing began to steady, though my nerves were still shot. By the time I emerged onto the dirt road, the whisper was gone. I stood there, heart hammering, sweat pouring down my face, scanning the area for any sign of danger. The sun was still bright, illuminating a stretch of road that disappeared into the distance. A few crows circled overhead, cawing every so often. I took a moment to gather myself. I pressed my hands to my thighs, trying to slow my breathing. The silence felt jarring. Even the slightest noise made me jump. My legs trembled. I looked back at the entrance to the side trail, half expecting something to emerge from the grass. Nothing did. I told myself I had to get home. I started walking along the dirt road, keeping my eyes forward. Occasionally I glanced back, but the path stayed empty. Eventually, I heard cars on a main road, and that sound was the most welcome noise I could imagine. I stepped onto the pavement and spotted a gas station sign in the distance. I picked up the pace, wanting the comfort of other people and open space. Once I reached the gas station, I stopped next to a parked truck, leaning against it. My shirt was drenched in sweat, and my mouth felt like sandpaper. A part of me wanted to ask the clerk if there were any stories about that trail, if other people had heard or seen anything strange. But I couldn't form the words without feeling ridiculous. I was still shaken. After I got home, I couldn't stop replaying the events. My mind kept going to the question of who or what could have known my name. I examined my memory. Was it really saying my name? Or was it some distorted sound that my mind interpreted that way? Either possibility gave me chills. My legs were sore from running faster and longer than normal, and I collapsed onto my couch. I turned on the TV for background noise, anything to distract me from the memory of that whisper. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a weird acoustic effect, or maybe someone was hiding in the grass, calling out. But I couldn't ignore how consistent it was, how it never sounded farther away or closer, and how it matched my pace even when I sprinted. Whenever I recalled those moments, the hair on my arms stood up. I haven't returned to that trail since. It's been months, and I still avoid that area. When friends ask if I want to go hiking or running in the countryside, I make excuses. I choose routes that have plenty of people around, or at least a clear line of sight. I don't mind the noise of a busy park anymore. I actually welcome it. I've considered sharing my experience online, but I can't bring myself to deal with the comments that might follow. It's easier to keep it to myself, though I sometimes wake up at night. Sure, I've heard my name whispered in the hallway. That day on the trail taught me that sometimes you can't explain everything you encounter. It also reminded me that isolation has a dark side. I used to crave these quiet, secluded runs, thinking it was a perfect way to clear my head. But now, the thought of tall grass on either side of me makes my skin crawl. I can still feel the humidity and hear the crunch of the dirt underfoot. I can still sense the moment my name first reached my ears in that faint, breathy tone. And I don't think I'll ever be able to shake that memory, no matter how many crowded parks I run through. I still remember the moment we saw the light hovering above the trees and how it changed everything about that trip. There were 4 of us, myself, Mark, Anna, and Dylan, and we'd planned a relaxed weekend of hiking and camping in a remote mountain area. We chose a spot known for its quiet trails and scenic views, hoping to escape the usual tourist routes. On the first day, we hiked for several hours, chatting and taking photos of the landscape. We passed only a handful of other hikers, which was exactly what we wanted. By evening, we found a good clearing to set up camp. The spot was flat, with enough space for our 2 tents. We gathered some wood for a small fire, boiled water for instant meals, and then sat under the growing darkness, enjoying the sense of isolation. We were joking about everything from old college stories to new work gossip, when Anna paused mid-laugh and pointed at something above the treetops. At first, we assumed it was a plane or a drone, but it moved in a strange zigzag pattern. It emitted a bright white glow, yet we heard no sound. Mark grabbed a flashlight and flicked it off and on, almost as a playful signal. We waited, expecting the light to react. It just stayed there, shifting left and right in short, quick movements. Dylan thought it might be a drone someone was flying in the distance, but the longer we watched, the less it behaved like any drone we had seen. It seemed too steady, too silent, and it didn't have the typical flashing lights. We tried to ignore it for a while, but it stayed in the same general area, drifting a little among the treetops. It felt like it was watching us, even though we couldn't be sure. We ate dinner with less enthusiasm, and the conversation became guarded. Anna looked up every few seconds, and I noticed Mark doing the same. Dylan pretended it didn't bother him, but I saw him fidget with his flashlight. Something about that light made us uneasy. It was as if the air around our little camp carried a tension that hadn't been there before. After we finished eating, we sat around our fire for a bit. The flames flickered over our tired faces, and the occasional pop of the wood was the only sound besides crickets. Anna said she felt we should keep watch, maybe take turns staying awake through the night. Mark and Dylan didn't protest. I hesitated, because that kind of plan seemed dramatic, but I couldn't deny the knot of anxiety in my stomach. We ultimately agreed to rotate in 2-hour shifts. I offered to take the first watch, while the others tried to get some sleep. Around midnight, the fire had burned down to embers, and I was sitting just outside my tent, scanning the trees for any hint of that glow. I strained my ears, thinking maybe I'd pick up a whir or hum if it was indeed a drone. The forest around us was quiet, though. The occasional rustle of leaves or a distant animal cry kept me alert. My chest felt tight from the awareness that something was out there, watching or drifting close by. I kept my flashlight in hand, resisting the urge to shine it into the sky. At one point, I thought I glimpsed the light flashing in and out of view. I stood, leaning forward to see better. It was definitely there, near the tree line. My heart pounded, and my palms got sweaty. I couldn't wake the others for every little movement, so I watched alone, feeling the tension build. My brain struggled with rational explanations, maybe a trick of reflection or an odd atmospheric effect, but it moved with purpose, weaving among the branches. When my 2 hours ended, I quietly shook Dylan awake. He crawled out of his tent, muttering something about how this was probably nothing but a weird toy. I handed him the flashlight, whispered what I'd seen, and collapsed into my sleeping bag. My body was tired, but my mind still raced. Eventually, the exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. Sometime later, Mark's voice startled me. He shook my shoulder, telling me it was my turn again. He looked spooked, whispering that the light had gotten closer while Dylan was on watch, though it never came close enough to reveal its source. Dylan insisted it circled the camp's perimeter at least twice, darting behind trees whenever he tried to shine his light on it. Anna lay awake, listening. She looked more annoyed than afraid, but I could sense a layer of anxiety behind her eyes. We all stepped outside for a moment, scanning the darkness. The sky was clear, the stars visible, and the only unnatural light was that same single glow beyond the tree line. Mark and Anna went back to sleep, leaving me alone with Dylan's story swirling in my head. I perched on a log, focusing on the rhythmic sound of my breath. The forest had a strange hush. Sometimes you can hear small nocturnal animals scurrying around, or the wind moving through the branches. But that night, everything felt still. I could feel each beat of my heart, and I replayed in my mind the image of that white glow weaving between tree trunks. I wondered if we should leave right then, but the idea of hiking in the dark through uneven terrain felt worse. I stared into the blackness, half expecting something to jump out or rush toward our camp. When morning finally arrived, the relief among our group was obvious. Sunlight seemed to push away the lingering sense of dread. We ate a quick breakfast, discussing whether to stay another night as we had originally planned. Anna was the first to suggest leaving earlier. She said she felt uneasy with that strange observation from the night before. Mark and Dylan looked torn. They both wanted to see the scenic overlook that was another few miles ahead. We agreed to at least reach that overlook by mid-afternoon and then decide if we'd camp again or head back. We packed up the tents and started on the next leg of the hike. The path was shaded by tall pine trees, and for a while we fell into an easy rhythm of walking. None of us talked much about the night. Eventually, we reached a spot with a panoramic view of the valleys and distant peaks. We took a few pictures, admired the scenery, and ate lunch. Everyone was a bit calmer in the daylight. The conversation turned to normal hiking banter, blisters, water consumption, the best brand of trail shoes. But in the back of my mind, I wondered if that light would appear again once night fell. we decided to camp one more night in a clearing near a small creek. It was a beautiful spot, with soft ground for the tents and plenty of rocks to build a decent fire ring. Still, we all seemed on edge. Even though we tried to relax, the memory of that silent, drifting glow overshadowed our excitement for nature. After dinner, we sat around the fire as the sky turned from orange to deep blue, anticipating that moment when full darkness would arrive. Sure enough, we spotted the light again. This time, it stayed at a greater distance, hovering among the higher branches. Dylan tried to use a high-powered flashlight he'd brought, aiming at the glow. The beam cut through the darkness, but the light seemed to dodge it, disappearing behind the treetops, only to reappear on the other side. Anna stood and cursed under her breath. Mark paced near the tents, scanning the sky. I felt a creeping chill in my gut, like we were being toyed with. My skin prickled at the idea that something was studying us. The mood in our group shifted from fear to anger. Mark started shouting into the trees, telling whoever was controlling that thing to stop messing with us. He demanded they show themselves. No answer came. The light just flickered in place, then vanished. We all stared for a moment, expecting it to pop back up. Minutes passed. Dylan lowered his flashlight, and Anna let out a shaky breath. I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. A part of me wanted closure, to see it up close and confirm it was some elaborate trick, but it stayed gone. We agreed to keep the same watch rotation, although we secretly hoped we wouldn't need it. Mark was first. After an hour or so, I heard him whisper my name from outside my tent. I unzipped the flap. He told me the light was back, but now it was approaching the edge of our camp. My heart thudded as I slipped on my boots and stepped out. Sure enough, it glowed between the trunks, closer than before. My chest tightened, and I felt a flash of adrenaline. Anna and Dylan joined us, the four of us standing together, flashlights aimed at the trees. The white glow didn't move for a few long seconds. Then it started a slow circle around the camp, drifting at about head height. We tried to follow it, stumbling over uneven ground. Branches scratched our arms as we maneuvered around the perimeter. The glow weaved in and out of sight, as if guided by an intelligence that knew exactly how to hide behind the trunks. Anna muttered something about ending this, raising a rock as if she planned to throw it. Mark told her not to bother. Dylan kept shining the flashlight, but it was useless. We never got a clear view of any device or creature. Eventually, it receded farther into the forest, out of our line of sight. We stood there in a circle, breathing hard, scanning the darkness. My throat felt dry. I was trembling, partly from fear, partly from frustration. Mark said we should break camp at dawn and leave. The rest of us agreed without hesitation. We stayed up, dozing in shifts again, but that light never returned for the remainder of the night. By sunrise, we packed everything at top speed. The energy in our group was a mix of exhaustion and urgency, like we'd all decided we'd had enough of this place. Normally, packing up would be a casual process, but we threw gear into our backpacks, barely speaking, focused only on getting off that mountain. During our hike back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the light to appear. It never did. The trail felt too quiet, as though the forest was as eager for us to leave as we were to get away. When we finally reached the trailhead parking area, we let out collective sighs of relief. We loaded the car and didn't talk about it until we were miles away, on a more populated highway. That's when Mark finally broke the silence, saying, "What the hell was that?" No one had a good answer. Dylan proposed theories, some advanced drone technology or a rare atmospheric event. Anna stayed quiet, staring out the window. I just drove, replaying the events in my head. We hadn't found any explanation for that light. We had no proof, no photos that captured it, and nobody else around to confirm our story. But the memory stuck with us. Even now, when the four of us meet, we sometimes bring it up. We'll ask if anyone ever discovered new information or read about similar reports in that region. We've never found anything definitive. All we know is what we experienced, a glowing white light that seemed to follow us, observe us, and then disappear without a trace. It changed the way I view those quiet mountain trails. I'm still drawn to nature and hiking, but I can't shake the uneasy feeling that there are things out there beyond my understanding. And whenever the conversation turns to camping in remote areas again, none of us is ever eager to volunteer. Our memories of that silent, drifting light remain too vivid, and the sense of being watched in the dark is something none of us wants to revisit soon. I remember the day I discovered the hidden trapdoor in the attic. I'd just purchased an old two-story house with the intention of renovating it and eventually selling it. The place looked solid, even if the layout felt a bit strange. I spent the first couple of days checking each room, making note of the repairs needed. The blueprint I had was old, and I quickly noticed it didn't match the actual space in some areas. Still, I assumed it was just outdated information. On the third day, I climbed up to the attic to assess the insulation and see if there was anything left behind by previous owners. The attic was cramped, with a low ceiling and faded wooden beams. Dust floated in the air, making me cough. Cobwebs stuck to my hair if I stood up too quickly. As I walked around with a flashlight, I noticed a section of the ceiling that looked different. It was a rectangular panel, slightly raised above the surrounding boards. It blended in, but not perfectly. Something about it caught my eye. I dragged a small stepladder over and gently pressed on the panel with my fingertips. It moved a little, confirming it was some kind of door. I found a simple latch near one edge. My pulse quickened for reasons I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just curiosity, but I felt a creeping unease. Still, I lifted the latch. The wood creaked, and the panel swung open to reveal a tiny, hidden compartment. I shone my flashlight inside. It was mostly empty, except for thick dust and a few spider webs. The air felt colder in there, which I thought was odd. It smelled stale, like an abandoned cellar. I tried to stick my head in, but the opening was too small. I could only see about half the space. Judging by the beams, I guessed it was barely large enough for a person to crawl around. I felt a sudden sense of being watched. It made my neck tingle. The hair on my arms stood up. I stood there, breathing lightly, telling myself I was imagining things. After a minute or two, I snapped out of it. I noted the compartment's existence on a pad of paper I carried around for renovation details, then gently closed the panel. I returned downstairs, my mind spinning with questions about why the trapdoor wasn't in the official plans. Over the next few days, I worked on other parts of the house, repairing drywall in the living room, fixing a leaky pipe in the kitchen, and checking the electrical wiring in various rooms. Despite staying busy, I couldn't shake that strange feeling about the attic. At night, when I tried to sleep, I kept imagining small sounds coming from above, soft creaks, faint tapping. Initially, I dismissed it as the old wood contracting, but each time I heard a noise, I felt a flutter in my stomach. One evening, I decided to investigate again. It was late, and I was tired of letting my imagination run wild. I climbed into the attic with a better flashlight and a crowbar, just in case I needed to pry something open. Everything looked the same as before, but the air felt heavier than usual. I made my way to the panel and knelt down. I hesitated, staring at the latch. My heart thumped harder with each passing second. Finally, I gripped the latch and opened the panel once more. The musty smell hit me again, and my flashlight beam revealed the cramped space beyond. I called out, "Hello?" feeling a little silly. My voice echoed softly, then died. No response. I stuck my head and shoulders through the opening, shining the light around. Dust motes floated in the beam. The space was indeed tiny and empty. No furniture, no boxes, nothing that could explain the strange tension I felt. Still, the temperature was noticeably cooler in there. I scanned the wooden beams and insulation, looking for rodent droppings or evidence of an animal infestation. Nothing. After a few minutes, I relatched the panel, more confused than ever. I went back downstairs and tried to calm my nerves by watching some TV. But the feeling that something was off stayed with me. As the renovations progressed, I occasionally heard odd noises at night. Sometimes it was a soft scrape, other times a gentle knocking. I told myself it was the wind or the house settling. But it was hard to believe that when it always seemed to originate from the attic area. One morning, I woke up to find the attic door open. That door had a simple latch from the inside, and I always made sure it was closed because the attic was dusty. Yet there it was, standing ajar. My skin prickled. I climbed up quickly, checked the hidden panel, and saw it was still sealed. My mind raced with possible explanations. Maybe I'd forgotten to close the attic door properly, but I knew I hadn't. Each night my dreams got worse. I pictured a dark figure with elongated arms crawling out of that hidden space. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding so loud it drowned out any other sound. I found myself avoiding the attic unless it was absolutely necessary for the renovation work. Even then, I made quick visits, never lingering. I was jumpier, more aware of every creak in the floorboards. One afternoon, I noticed the panel looked slightly crooked, as if it had been pushed from the inside. I checked the latch, and it was loose. I wondered if the wood had warped, so I took some nails and hammered them into the edges of the panel, hoping to secure it. I felt a rush of relief, thinking that even if an animal was finding its way inside, it wouldn't be able to push past the nails. That night, I slept a bit better. The following morning, I discovered the nails partially pulled out, and the panel was slightly ajar again. My stomach did a slow flip. I stood there, staring in disbelief. The nails were still there, but they were protruding as if someone had pried at the panel from the inside. I tried to remain logical. Maybe the wood's expansion and contraction had forced the nails out, but I couldn't fully convince myself. My nerves started to wear thin. Each night became a battle against my own fears. I kept imagining the hidden space overhead. I'd glance at the ceiling, half expecting to hear a scraping sound. One evening, while I was in the living room, I heard distinct tapping coming from upstairs. It was a slow, deliberate pattern. Tap, tap, pause, tap. My face felt cold. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly climbed the stairs, feeling my legs quiver. By the time I reached the attic door, the tapping had stopped. I opened the door to find darkness. I aimed the flashlight at the ceiling and saw no movement. Still, the silence felt oppressive. I decided I couldn't just live with this creeping anxiety. I set a plan to permanently seal that hidden compartment. I purchased heavy-duty screws and a metal plate to cover the panel's edges. I wanted to make sure nothing could push it open from the inside. On a Saturday morning, I hauled my tools into the attic and placed the metal plate around the panel. My hands shook a little as I drilled the screws in, each one making a high-pitched squeal that echoed in the attic. By the time I finished, Sweat dripped down my forehead and my arms felt sore. I tapped the metal plate to test its stability. It was secure. I stepped down the ladder, exhaling a long breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over the situation. That night, I slept more peacefully. No strange sounds woke me. When I checked the attic the next day, everything looked the same. The metal plate was still in place, and the panel was firmly shut. For a few days, life felt normal. I continued my renovation tasks without any new scares. However, a part of me couldn't forget the unease I'd felt. In the back of my mind, I worried that sealing the space might not be enough, but I pushed those thoughts aside. By the end of the week, I decided it was time to move on to the final phases of renovation. I started painting walls, installing new fixtures, and cleaning the floors. The night before my final inspection, I had a dream that the panel in the attic was wide open and something was staring down at me. I woke with a jolt, heart pounding. It was around 3 a.m. The house was dark and quiet. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting to hear a sound. Nothing. After a few minutes, I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and forced myself to check the attic. The door was closed, the new metal plate was intact, and everything seemed fine. Still, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I hurried downstairs and locked my bedroom door, determined to just get through the night. I finished the renovation and listed the house for sale. I gave minimal tours, only to serious buyers. I tried to focus on the positive features, the spacious rooms, the classic architecture, the updated kitchen. I never mentioned the hidden trapdoor or the experiences I'd had. Perhaps I should have disclosed it, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Maybe I feared they'd think I was crazy, or maybe I just wanted to forget about it. Eventually, I sold the house to a young couple. They seemed excited to own an older property with character. I signed the paperwork and handed over the keys, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. I told myself it was just a house, and I had sealed away whatever was in that tiny space. I moved on to my next project, but I couldn't fully erase the memory. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine hearing those small noises again. My mind drifts back to that hidden panel with its latch and the cold air behind it. I wonder if the new owners will ever notice it, or if they'll leave it sealed. I've had nightmares where I'm back in that attic, the nails are ripped out, and the panel is swinging open. I still feel a chill in my spine when I recall the creaking wood and the sensation of being watched. Maybe it was nothing more than my imagination, fueled by the stress of renovation. Or maybe there was something in that cramped, dusty space that didn't want to be disturbed. Either way, I learned a lesson. Some secrets in old houses are better left alone, and sometimes, even if you seal them up, they find a way to linger in your thoughts, reminding you that certain doors should stay closed. I first noticed the barking around midnight, not long after I moved into my small house at the edge of town. At first I assumed a neighbor's dog had gotten loose, but the sound wasn't quite right. It came in short bursts, followed by long pauses, as if whoever or whatever was making it needed to remember how a bark should sound. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I tried ignoring it the first couple of nights, hoping it was just a stray dog passing by, but it returned every single night at the same time. By the end of that week, I was on edge. One night, I decided to take a closer look. I waited until the barking started, then grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into my backyard. My fence is a simple wooden barrier about 5 feet high. I walked along it, sweeping the flashlight beam over the edges of the property. The barking sounded like it was coming from behind the fence, somewhere near the tree line. I shouted, "Hey, quiet!" But it continued, only pausing briefly as if it heard me, then resuming that unnatural sound. I climbed on a small crate to peek over the fence. My heart thumped in my ears. In the dim moonlight, I saw a shape crouched near the tall grass. It was bigger than I expected, larger than a typical stray dog. I clicked my flashlight on and aimed it. The moment the light hit that shape, it jerked away, scuttling backward awkwardly. I couldn't see its face clearly, but its limbs looked strangely proportioned, longer and thinner than a normal animal. Parts of it had sparse hair, while other parts looked bare. Then it disappeared into the darkness, leaving the yard quiet. My gut twisted. I had no idea what I'd just seen. My breath felt shallow, and my skin crawled. I hopped down from the crate, locked my door, and paced around my living room. I considered calling the police, but I couldn't think of what to say. I saw something that might be a sick dog, or maybe something else. I decided to see if the situation would repeat. Sure enough, the next night, around midnight, the barking began again. It echoed through my yard, making me jump. I stepped outside, but I didn't climb the crate this time. Instead, I aimed my flashlight over the fence slats, trying to catch a glimpse between the gaps. I saw movement at the far corner, near some shrubs. The barking paused, turning into a softer, guttural noise. My heart pounded. I yelled, "Go away!" and banged the flashlight against the fence. The shape moved off, and the barking receded. When I went back inside, I still felt that tightness in my chest. I hardly slept. Over the next few days, I asked a couple of neighbors if they'd heard anything strange at night. One shrugged and mentioned hearing distant howls from time to time, but nobody seemed alarmed. Another neighbor said she sometimes heard a dog, but assumed it belonged to someone on the next street. I didn't press too hard, not wanting to sound paranoid. Still, the nightly barking continued, always around the same time, always with that odd, forced tone. It reminded me of a person trying to mimic a dog without ever having heard one before. I tried different tactics. I banged pots and pans, hoping the loud noise would scare it off for good. It ran into the bushes but returned a few minutes later. I shone my flashlight directly at it from multiple angles. It would shuffle away, then reappear. My stress rose with every attempt. My eyes stung from lack of sleep, and my patience wore thin. Eventually, I decided to get a better look. One weekend, I set up a small trail camera near the fence line, pointed toward the area where I'd seen it lurking. The camera was designed to capture any motion at night. I felt a mix of dread and curiosity as I positioned it. What if I recorded something that wasn't just a dog? Was I prepared to see it? I pressed on, telling myself it was better to have proof than to keep guessing. That night, the barking began as usual. I sat inside, lights off, glancing out my window. The moon was bright, casting faint shadows across my backyard. My heart rate picked up the moment I heard the first bark. It still sounded off, like a broken recording. I forced myself to stay calm, reminding myself the camera was out there, capturing everything. In the morning, I fetched the camera. My hands trembled a little as I plugged it into my laptop. I skimmed through the footage. For the first few hours, there was nothing except my yard and the occasional flicker of passing headlights on a distant road. Then, around midnight, the camera recorded movement. At first, I saw a vague shape approach the fence. It was hunched, with a curved spine. Its limbs looked wrong, almost human-like, but not quite. My stomach twisted at the sight. The creature lifted its head in what might have been a barking motion, though the camera's microphone didn't pick up audio well. Then it dropped back to a crouch and moved around in stiff, unnatural steps, before vanishing from frame. I felt cold all over. It clearly wasn't just a normal dog. I couldn't see its face in detail, but it was enough to tell me that something abnormal was skulking around my property each night. That explained the bizarre barking, the way it was too big and too off balance. My throat went dry as I sat there, replaying the footage. I debated showing it to the police or animal control, but I worried they'd dismiss me or think it was just a weird dog. I stared at the screen, watching that shape appear and disappear. My pulse throbbed in my temples. The next couple of nights, I tried staying indoors, curtains shut, pretending not to hear anything. But the barking became more insistent. It sounded closer, and it lasted longer. I had trouble focusing on anything after sundown. Even the slightest noise made me jump. I'd snap on the porch light if I heard rustling, but by the time I looked out, I would catch only a glimpse of something pale slipping past the fence. One night, I mustered the courage to yell, "I'm calling the police," even though I hadn't dialed yet. The barking paused, then it resumed, slower and more drawn out. I considered actually calling the police, but I still hesitated. What if it really was some sick or stray animal and I was overreacting? What if they came out and found nothing, leaving me looking foolish? My hesitation felt ridiculous, but it was real. Instead, I reached out to a local wildlife control service. They told me they mostly handle raccoons, possums, and the occasional fox. When I tried to describe this creature, they seemed skeptical. They suggested I set traps, but from the footage, I doubted a simple cage would do anything. This thing was large and cautious. One night I stood guard in my backyard, flashlight in one hand, a loud air horn in the other. The barking started at midnight, as usual. My chest tightened. I raised the flashlight just in time to see it peek over the fence. Its face was partially visible. It had a snout, but it looked malformed, with patches of sparse fur on pale skin. I froze, air horn gripped tight. For a second, it stared right at me, at least it seemed so. Then it let out that forced bark, like it was mocking a real dog's sound. My mind raced with fear and confusion. I pressed the air horn button, and a shrill blast cut through the night. The creature jerked away, disappearing from view. My heart hammered as I stayed there, scanning the darkness. It didn't return that night. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe the air horn was enough of a deterrent. But the next evening, just past midnight, it was back. I heard the barking start again, louder than before. I grabbed the air horn and rushed outside, flipping the porch light on. I set off the horn in a series of blasts. The barking faded, but I caught a glimpse of the creature weaving between the shadows, as if it wasn't sure whether to flee or stay. Eventually it slunk away, leaving me standing there, adrenaline pumping. This pattern went on for several more days. The air horn would drive it back, but not permanently. Each time, I felt more worn down. My eyes had dark circles, and my mind was constantly on edge. I talked to a couple more neighbors, but none of them had seen anything like what I described. One offered to come over with a rifle, but that idea made me uneasy. I didn't want anyone firing bullets near my property, especially if we didn't fully understand what this creature was. Still, I felt cornered. At last, I decided to install better floodlights around my yard. I hoped strong illumination would keep it away. I spent an entire Saturday on a ladder, connecting motion-activated lights at strategic points along my fence. That night, I waited inside, peeking out from a dark window. Around midnight, the barking started again. My heart sank. After a few seconds, the floodlights flared on, bathing the yard in bright white light. I saw the creature flinch, raising one distorted limb to shield its eyes. It tried to move around, searching for a darker spot. The lights followed its movement, triggered by each slight motion. It made a strange, guttural noise, not quite a bark this time. I watched, my breath catching, as it retreated toward the far corner of the fence. The light reached it there, too. It hesitated, gave one last scratchy bark, then scrambled over some old boards and disappeared into the darkness beyond. My heart raced for a solid 10 minutes after it was gone. I double-checked the locks on my doors, then spent the rest of the night replaying the moment in my head. Over the next week, I still heard occasional barking at a distance, but not in my yard. The motion-activated lights seemed to discourage it from coming closer. I could sometimes pick out that forced barking sound somewhere in the night, but it no longer pressed right up against my fence. That brought some level of relief, though I remained jumpy. I still woke at midnight, listening for it. Eventually, the barking stopped altogether. I don't know if the creature moved on or if it found a different territory. A part of me wanted to believe it was just a diseased dog that finally wandered off, but the memory of those distorted limbs and patchy fur still lingers. I did show the trail camera footage to a friend who works as a vet assistant. She had no idea what it could be. It's been months since that final encounter. The nights are quieter, though I still flinch if I hear any stray dogs bark in the distance. I haven't taken down the floodlights, and I keep my air horn by the back door, just in case. When people ask me why I'm so on guard, I give them a vague answer about a wild animal problem. I'm not sure how to explain the entire story without sounding paranoid. Sometimes I still walk outside at midnight, half expecting that forced barking to start up. Even though it's gone, the memory of that noise echoes in my head. I don't think I'll ever forget the sight of it crouched by my fence, staring back at me with those strange, uneven eyes, making that bark that never sounded like any real dog. I was already tired when I decided to drive through the night. The clock on my dashboard read a little after midnight, and I had at least 3 more hours until the next sizable town. The highway stretched out in front of me, empty except for the occasional reflectors on the guardrails. My eyes were beginning to ache from staring at the dark road. The radio stations kept fading in and out of static. I thought about stopping at a rest area, but I didn't see any signs indicating one was close. So I kept driving, determined to make it to my destination by morning. After another half hour of that silent stretch, I saw something on the side of the road up ahead. The headlights illuminated a figure walking along the shoulder. He wore dark clothing, which made him blend with the night. At first I slowed down, thinking maybe he needed help or had a car issue. But as I got closer, the man kept his face turned away from me, and his posture looked off somehow, like he was hunched or stiff. A little alarm went off in my head. I decided to pass him by without stopping. I didn't want any trouble. The thought of pulling over in that empty place made me uneasy, so I drove past. I got a brief glimpse of his profile, pale skin, expressionless. His arms hung straight at his sides, and he marched forward at a slow, steady pace. A few miles later, I glanced at the rearview mirror out of habit. I couldn't see anything except darkness. I told myself to forget about the man. People walk on lonely roads sometimes. Maybe he was out of gas. But a weird feeling settled in my stomach. The hair on my neck prickled, as if I'd made a bad choice by not checking on him. My shoulders felt tight, and I gripped the steering wheel a bit harder. I drove for another 15 minutes and was about to reach for a bottle of water when I saw another figure on the roadside. He looked exactly the same as the man I'd just passed. Dark clothes, slightly hunched, same height. I felt a jolt in my chest, I had traveled far enough that it made no sense for him to be this far ahead. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe it was a different person wearing similar clothing. Still, my hands started shaking. My mouth went dry. I passed him quickly, keeping my eyes on the road. This time I managed only a brief side glance, and it sure looked like the same man, same posture. My heart pounded faster. I tried to convince myself I was just overreacting. I drove on, scanning the horizon for buildings or lights, but there was nothing except flat fields. I pressed the gas a bit harder, hoping to outrun my nerves. 10 more minutes crawled by. Then, in the distance, my headlights picked up another shape on the shoulder. The tension in my chest escalated. As I got closer, I recognized the same silhouette. Dark clothing, hunched stance. I felt my stomach churn. It was the same man. It couldn't be, but it was. This time I slowed down more. My palms were sweaty on the wheel. Part of me wanted to pull over and confront him, but that idea made my throat tighten with fear. Another part of me wanted to slam the accelerator and get out of there. My foot hovered between the brake and gas pedal. In the end, I decided to speed up. I wanted distance. The moment I passed him, I glanced in the mirror. He never turned his head to look at me. He just kept walking. My pulse was racing. My head felt cloudy. I knew something impossible was happening. I had driven a good distance between the sightings, yet it was the same man each time. I tried to dial someone on my phone, but there was no signal out here. I cursed under my breath, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind darted through explanations. Maybe I was exhausted and imagining things, or maybe some strange trick was unfolding. Neither made sense. After another long stretch, I thought I saw a light in the distance, maybe the glow of a small town. Relief surged. Then I noticed movement on the right side of the road. My foot twitched on the gas pedal. It was him again. I recognized the shape even before my headlights fully caught him. My chest felt like it might burst. This time I slowed down to a near crawl, scanning the road for turnoffs. I spotted a small side road leading back the way I'd come. I made a snap decision and turned the wheel. Gravel crunched under my tires as I veered off the main highway. I figured I'd circle back and see if I could exit onto a different route. Maybe I'd bypass this weird situation. I followed the gravel road for about 10 minutes. It was poorly lit, and the dust kicked up by my car made it hard to see. I looked for signage or any indication of civilization. Instead, the road curved back onto another lonely stretch, which I realized was the same highway. I ended up merging back onto it, cursing my luck. Not 30 seconds later, I spotted him again. He was walking on the shoulder, same direction as before, unchanged. My breath caught in my throat. It was as if he knew exactly where I would come out. I honked my horn in panic, a short, desperate beep. The man didn't react. He just walked steadily, arms at his sides. My skin crawled. I pressed the gas pedal, passing him again, this time swerving a bit as if to keep my distance. I drove faster, not caring about speed limits. The engine roared, and the road flew by in a blur. My thoughts tumbled over each other. My heart pounded against my rib cage. After maybe 15 minutes, I noticed an off-ramp sign. I decided to take it, see if I could find a rest stop or a gas station, any place with people. The ramp led to another dark 2-lane road. My headlights illuminated a wooden sign indicating the nearest town was 20 miles away. I sighed, tension weighing me down. I continued along this new road, breathing hard. Then I froze. In the distance, I saw a figure. I slowed to a near stop, dread clenching my gut. Sure enough, it was him again, the same dark figure about 100 yards ahead on the left shoulder. The road was too narrow to pass with comfort, but I had no choice. I had to drive by him. My limbs tingled with a cold, electric fear. My mouth felt so dry that I couldn't swallow properly. As I drew closer, the man stayed in the same posture, head down, arms hanging, walking in that slow, methodical pace. I wanted to shout, to honk, to do something, but I just stared, hands shaking on the wheel. Then I saw an opening in the road to my right, a place to turn around. Without hesitating, I swung the car sharply, tires skidding. Gravel spat out behind me. My heart thumped painfully. I sped back the way I'd come, hoping to rejoin the highway and head in the opposite direction. Maybe I could outrun him for good. When I got back to the highway, I turned west, away from my original route. I felt a brief sense of relief. The sky to the east had the faintest glow, indicating dawn was a couple of hours away. I figured if I could keep driving long enough, morning light might make everything normal again. I clung to that idea. For a good 30 minutes the road stayed empty. My pulse began to settle. I caught my reflection in the mirror, sweat beaded on my forehead, my eyes bloodshot. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself it had been some bizarre dream. Maybe I was so tired I confused different people for the same man. But deep down, I knew something unnatural was going on. Then, like a punch to the gut, I saw him up ahead in the dim glow of my headlights. This time, I let out a cry of frustration and fear. I slammed on the brakes, stopping a dozen yards behind him. The car rocked slightly with the sudden halt. My headlights lit up his back. He wore a dark jacket, possibly black or navy, so faded I couldn't tell. He didn't turn around. He just kept walking as if my car didn't exist. I started to roll forward slowly, my foot shaky on the pedal. Part of me wanted to confront him on foot, to see his face. Another part of me was terrified of what might happen if I got too close. I decided to get out of the car anyway. My heart pounded so hard I felt dizzy. I turned off the engine and grabbed a flashlight from the passenger seat. The night air was cold against my sweaty skin when I opened the door. My knees felt weak as I stepped onto the asphalt. I yelled, "Hey!" as loud as I could. The word echoed across the empty fields. The man didn't stop. He maintained that same mechanical stride. My pulse hammered in my ears. I took a few steps closer, shining the flashlight. I could see the details of his jacket now, worn fabric, frayed at the seams. My hand trembled. I noticed he was about my height. I called out again, "Who are you? What do you want?" No response. He didn't even slow down. I tried to approach. I got within a couple of yards. I tried to see his face, but he angled away, avoiding the light. When I reached out, he seemed to slide just out of reach, as if there was an invisible barrier. My fingertips brushed empty air. My breath caught, and a chill ran through my body. It was wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. I stumbled back, rushing to my car. I started the engine, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. I made a wild U-turn, tires screeching, and headed back in the direction I came from. I didn't care about the route anymore. I just needed distance. My mind spun. My heart pounded. I kept looking in the mirror, expecting to see him on the roadside again, but it was just the empty blackness behind me. I tried my phone. Still no signal. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stay focused on the road. Eventually, a hint of sunrise began to color the horizon. I felt an odd surge of hope. The headlights became less necessary as the sky brightened. I drove until I spotted a small sign for a gas station a few miles ahead. I followed it, turning onto a county road that led me to a beat-up station with a single pump. The place looked deserted, but at least it was lit. I parked under the flickering fluorescent light. My whole body shook as I got out of the car. I stepped into the station's small convenience store area. The door chimed. A tired-looking cashier glanced up but didn't say much. The bright lights inside felt disorienting after hours of darkness. I bought a bottle of water and drank half of it in one gulp. My hands still trembled, and I felt my pulse thrumming in my neck. I thought about telling the cashier what I'd seen, but I couldn't find the words. I worried he'd think I was delusional or on something. I went back to my car and sat there for a few minutes, engine off, trying to gather my thoughts. The sun was rising, painting the sky in pale orange. Traffic on the highway picked up slightly. I debated whether I should continue my trip or find a motel. The memory of that figure on the side of the road clung to me like a weight on my chest. In the end, I drove on, but only after the sun was fully up. I took the next main exit and headed to a larger town. I never saw the man in daylight. It was as though he vanished with the night. Even now, whenever I pass a lonely stretch of road, I catch myself scanning the shoulder, half expecting to see that hunched figure plodding along. The idea makes my skin crawl. I still can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that until the dawn broke, he kept appearing no matter which route I took, never stopping, never looking at me, always ahead of me like some impossible echo. And from that moment on, I've avoided night drives whenever I can, because part of me fears he might still be out there waiting. I remember the night I stayed late at the office to finish a project. The clock on my computer read just past 11 p.m. Most of the other employees had gone home hours ago, leaving only a dim corridor light and the quiet hum of ventilation. The building was old, with outdated fixtures and a faint smell of cleaning solution that lingered after the janitorial staff finished their rounds. My eyes burned from staring at my monitor for too long, and my neck felt stiff. But I wanted to wrap up my work so I wouldn't have to return early the next morning. Finally, I decided to call it a night. I saved my files, powered down my computer, and slipped my laptop into my bag. I flipped off the lights in my office, stepping into the hallway. The place felt emptier than usual, as if the air itself was heavy. My footsteps echoed against the walls. I headed toward the elevator bank near the center of the floor. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered slightly, making me blink a few times. I pressed the down button and waited. A moment later, I heard the familiar ding. The doors opened to an empty elevator cab. The interior lights felt brighter than normal. I stepped inside, hit the button for the lobby, and leaned back against the wall. The doors slid shut. Then the elevator jerked into motion, heading down in a slow, steady descent. I let my eyes close for a second, feeling the ache in my shoulders. The ride was silent, apart from the hum of the elevator motor. Around the 10th floor, the elevator shuddered slightly, making me open my eyes and shift my stance. It slowed and came to a stop at a floor I hadn't requested. The panel above the door showed a floor number, but I wasn't sure if it was accurate because it flickered once. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. I peered into the corridor. It looked empty. The lights were off except for emergency fixtures casting a faint glow on the carpet. I frowned, a knot forming in my stomach. Nobody was standing there. I waited a second, expecting to see someone round the corner or rush to catch the elevator. No one appeared. I reached over and tapped the door close button. The doors lingered a moment, then finally slid shut. The elevator started moving again. That was the first moment I felt something was off. It wasn't that I saw or heard anything specific, but I sensed a shift in the air, as though someone had stepped in. My skin prickled. I glanced around the empty cab, feeling a mild sense of unease. I told myself it was just an old elevator acting up, maybe stopping due to a glitch. I tried to relax, focusing on the floor numbers descending. After a few seconds, I felt a faint pressure, like a push against my shoulder, even though I was standing with my back to the wall. I jerked upright, my heart leaping. I instinctively looked behind me, but there was no one. My pulse started to pound. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on my body. Before I could steady my breathing, the elevator abruptly shuddered again and halted between floors. The lights flickered. I went for the control panel, pressing the lobby button several times, but the indicator didn't respond. I tried the emergency button. Nothing. I felt my heart rate rising. Being stuck in an elevator alone was stressful enough, but that odd sensation of a presence nearby made it worse. I decided to try the phone panel. I opened the small metal door where an emergency phone should be, only to see a broken handset. My stomach tightened. I pressed the alarm button repeatedly, hoping it would trigger something in the security office, but no sound came. The elevator was silent. The overhead light buzzed softly, and the air felt thick. Suddenly, I sensed movement to my left, as though someone brushed past. My skin went cold. I shot a look in that direction, expecting to see a co-worker or someone pranking me. Nothing was there. My breath hitched, my chest constricted. I backed into the corner of the elevator, feeling the stainless steel walls against my shoulders. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a firm shove on my right side. I stumbled into the wall with a yelp. My bag slid off my shoulder and hit the floor. Panic flared in my chest. I swung my arms in the space around me, trying to strike at whoever had pushed me, but I connected only with empty air. I felt no resistance, nothing solid. My mind struggled to grasp what was happening. I tried shouting, "Who's there?" My voice sounded shaky in the enclosed space. No answer came. I heard only the tremble in my own breath. I swung my arms again, stepping toward the center of the cab, but I still found no one. My heart hammered. My palms were sweaty. Every instinct told me something was here, but I couldn't see anything. Another push came, this time from the back, shoving me hard against the control panel. My hip banged into the buttons, and the elevator's lights flickered again. I felt a chill prickle across my scalp. I turned and flailed my arms blindly, trying to fight off an invisible force. My knuckles grazed the air, as if I was boxing with a ghost. I gasped for air, a sense of helplessness washing over me. The elevator doors opened suddenly, revealing a dim, empty hallway. My eyes darted to the opening. I thought about making a run for it, but before I could move, I felt a strong grip on my shoulder. It was like a cold hand pressing down. I couldn't see it, but the pressure was undeniable. Fear surged through me. Adrenaline pumped, and I pushed off the floor, twisting my body, trying to throw off whatever held me. At the same time, the doors began to close. I managed to lunge forward and wedge my forearm between the doors. They bounced back, and I stumbled out onto the floor. My bag was still inside, but I didn't care. I fell onto the hallway carpet, my knees hitting hard. I scrambled to my feet and whirled around, expecting to see something following me. The elevator stood there with its doors wide open, the lights still on inside. It looked empty, but I felt the same ominous energy. My breathing was ragged, and my legs felt shaky. I backed away, pressing my hand against my chest, trying to steady my racing heart. Then the doors slid shut on their own. The elevator resumed its motion, heading somewhere else. I watched the number panel above the door. It flickered through floors randomly, as if it couldn't decide which level to stop at. Eventually, it disappeared from sight. I stood there, swallowing hard. My mind reeled with questions and disbelief. My phone was in my bag, which was now gone with the elevator. The corridor around me was mostly dark, with only a few emergency lights. I looked around for a staircase sign, feeling desperate to put distance between me and that elevator. I spotted a stairwell door at the end of the hall. I hurried toward it, wincing at the pain in my knees and the lingering shock in my limbs. The stairwell was dim, but at least it felt solid and empty. I rushed down flight after flight, my footfalls echoing. My breath came in shallow bursts. Every so often I'd pause, thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but each time I turned around, there was only the flickering light of the stairwell. My nerves were raw, my skin felt clammy, and my heart wouldn't slow down. All I wanted was to escape the building. Finally, I reached the lobby level. I pushed open the door to find a deserted reception area. The security desk was empty. No guards in sight. I spotted a phone on the desk and rushed to it, picking up the receiver. It had a dial tone, so I called my own cell, hoping maybe I could figure out where the elevator took my bag. It rang and then went to voicemail. I left a panicked message, though I wasn't sure how that would help. At least I knew my phone was still on. I hung up and glanced around. A moment later, I heard the elevator ding in the lobby. My heart lurched. I crouched behind the desk, peering over the edge. The doors opened. The cab's interior light spilled onto the floor. It looked empty, but I caught a glimpse of my bag lying on the floor inside. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted my bag. It had my keys, phone, everything. But I was terrified to get close. I hesitated, crouched there, unable to decide. The elevator doors started to close again. I realized I couldn't leave my bag behind. I bolted from the desk and sprinted across the lobby, sliding my hand between the doors just before they sealed. They lurched open, and I reached in to grab my bag. As soon as my fingers brushed the strap, I felt that same freezing pressure on my wrist, like an invisible hand trying to yank me inside. My stomach flipped with fear. I managed to grab hold of the elevator frame and pull back. My shoulders strained with the effort. For a second, I thought I felt nails digging into my forearm, but there was nothing to see. I let out a desperate cry and gave one last tug. My bag came free, and I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The doors slammed shut as if frustrated. I sprawled on the lobby floor, clutching my bag. My heart thundered against my ribcage. My wrist stung where I'd felt that invisible grip, though there was no visible mark. The elevator rose again, lights flickering behind the small window on the doors. I lay there, breathing hard, sweat running down my temples. After a moment, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like rubber. I found my car keys in the bag, checked that my phone still worked. Battery at 10%. I raced outside through the main entrance, never looking back. The cool night air hit me like a shock. I fumbled to unlock my car and started the engine with shaking hands. The building's dark silhouette loomed in the rearview mirror as I pulled away. By the time I got home, my entire body ached. I locked every door and window, double-checking everything. I slept with the lights on, or at least I tried to sleep. My mind replayed each moment in that elevator. Even now, the memory of feeling an invisible force shoving me and grabbing me still makes my skin crawl. I never told my coworkers the full story. I only said I got stuck in the elevator for a bit. I couldn't bring myself to share the truth with them. I avoided using that elevator after dark. Eventually, I left that job and found a new position in a different building. But I still get a spike of anxiety whenever I'm alone in an elevator, and I can't help but feel that sudden pressure on my shoulder or wrist in the back of my mind. I don't know what it was or why it singled me out, but I know I never want to face it again. I noticed the silhouette in my window late one night when I was wrapping up work at my home office. The time on my computer said it was close to 1 in the morning, and I'd been typing for hours. My small desk sat against the wall, with a wide window to my right. I usually drew the curtains after dark, but that night I'd been too focused on my project to bother. I remember glancing up at the reflection in the window. My desk lamp illuminated my own face, and I saw my tired eyes staring back. But behind me, I caught a glimpse of a tall shape, something that looked like a person standing near the doorway. My throat tightened. I spun around in my chair, expecting to see someone in the room. The space was empty. My shoulders tensed, and I felt a slight tremor run through my arms. I took a slow breath, telling myself it had to be a trick of the light. I got up, walked to the window, and leaned closer to see if maybe it was an odd reflection of furniture. The hallway behind me was dark, but there was nothing near the doorway that resembled a person. I rubbed my eyes. I hadn't eaten much that day, and I thought maybe hunger or fatigue was playing games with my vision. After standing there for a few seconds, I shrugged it off and decided to ignore it. I returned to my chair, pulled the lamp a little closer, and went back to typing. About 15 minutes later, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I paused mid-sentence, and my gaze wandered back to the window. My own reflection was still there, but that shape reappeared. This time, it was more distinct, like a dark human outline standing right behind my desk chair. My pulse sped up. My hands turned clammy. I thought maybe my reflection had become distorted, but I couldn't figure out how it formed such a separate figure. Again, I jerked around to look at the room. Nothing. Just my bookshelves on one side, a small couch against the far wall, and the open door leading to the hallway. I stood up, feeling unsteady, and walked around the office, opening the closet door, checking corners. I even peeked into the hallway. No one was there. The house felt silent. No creaks, no footsteps. Still, my heartbeat thumped in my chest like a warning. I told myself I was being paranoid, maybe from too much coffee. I decided to shut the curtain, figuring if I couldn't see the reflection, I wouldn't freak out anymore. I grabbed the edge of the curtain and pulled it across. That should have solved the problem, but a few minutes later, I still felt that crawling sensation on my skin, like an unseen stare. My eyes kept drifting to the covered window, almost expecting the curtain to move. I tried to continue my work, but my focus was shot. My hands hovered over the keyboard, and I noticed how stiff my shoulders felt. I stood again and paced around, checking the hallway lights. I walked into the kitchen to grab a snack, hoping that stepping away would calm my nerves. The kitchen was brightly lit, and I felt better for a moment. I poured myself a glass of water and gulped it down. My stomach growled, so I grabbed an apple. Then I debated whether I should just call it a night. But I had a deadline. So I forced myself back into the office, flipping the light switch in the hallway off behind me. I sat down, adjusted my lamp, and stared at the computer screen. The curtain was drawn, so I couldn't see any reflection now. Still, my eyes kept flicking to that covered window. After about half an hour, I managed to draft a few more paragraphs. My shoulders started to relax, and I tried to convince myself I'd just seen a shadow. Then the desk lamp flickered. It happened so quickly that I almost missed it. A single flicker, then steady light again. My stomach tightened. I checked the lamp's cord, making sure it was plugged in properly. It was secure. The overhead light was off, so the lamp was my only light source. The house was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing. I rubbed my neck and told myself I was imagining things. Moments later, I felt a presence behind me, like someone was standing inches away from my chair. My heart pounded. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see a person looming over me. There was nothing but empty air. I exhaled shakily, feeling the adrenaline surge in my veins. I almost stood up to turn on the overhead light, but part of me feared what I might see in full brightness. I stayed seated, trying to breathe normally. After a few seconds, I found the courage to open the curtain a crack. I thought maybe seeing outside would ground me. I gently pulled the curtain back, just an inch or two. The night outside was dark, with only a faint street lamp glow in the distance. I shifted my eyes to the window's reflection. My own face peered back, looking pale and tense. And there it was again, that shape behind me. My heart lurched. It appeared taller this time, like it was straightening up. My breathing went shallow. I released the curtain, letting it fall back, and jumped out of my chair. I flipped on the overhead light, flooding the office with brightness. My eyes darted around. Every corner was empty. I tried to calm down, telling myself no one could be inside the house without me hearing them come in. The doors were locked. I even double-checked the front door and back door. Both were secure. Despite the heavy feeling in my chest, I resolved to finish my work. I'd just skip looking at the window altogether. I sat down, typed a few sentences, and forced myself to focus on the words. My fingers trembled on the keyboard. Then I heard a soft creak coming from behind me. It sounded like a floorboard under gentle pressure. My mind raced. The hair on my arms stood up. I had an overwhelming urge to spin my chair around again, but I stayed facing forward, eyes locked on the monitor. The lamp flickered once more. I couldn't handle it. I jumped out of my seat, nearly knocking the chair over. Without thinking, I yanked the curtain open wide, flooding the office with my reflection. This time, I clearly saw a tall, shadowy figure standing right behind where I had been sitting. Its form was dark, with no detailed features, just a head, shoulders, and what could be arms hanging at its sides. My own reflection was in front, my face contorted in shock. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. It stood still, like it was attached to me somehow. My hands shook so violently that I almost dropped the curtain. I whipped around, shining my desk lamp into the room. Nothing but empty space. When I turned back to the window, the figure was gone from the reflection. I felt dizzy. My throat was dry. I slammed the laptop shut, deciding I was done for the night. I couldn't stay in that office any longer. I grabbed my phone and left the room, flipping on every light in the house as I went. My heart was pounding in my ears. I made my way to the living room, where I sat on the couch, trying to calm down. The overhead light offered some comfort, but every flicker of shadow in the corners made me jump. I texted a friend, just to have some kind of human contact. I didn't tell them what was happening, only that I felt uneasy. We chatted about random things for a few minutes, which helped me breathe normally again. Eventually, I dozed off on the couch, lamp still on, phone in my hand. When I woke, sunlight was peeking through the blinds. I felt groggy, my back sore. I tried to rationalize everything: lack of sleep, eye strain, maybe a reflection from the hallway light. But a part of me couldn't let it go. Later that day, I walked back into my office. The window looked ordinary in the daylight. My reflection was just me, and the room behind me was clearly visible. No shapes, no figures. Still, I felt a knot in my stomach. I moved my desk so it no longer faced that window. I also replaced the lamp, telling myself the flickering had caused weird illusions. For several nights, I avoided working too late in that room. When I did have to stay late, I kept the curtains fully closed or left the overhead light on. But even with all that, I couldn't shake the memory of seeing that dark figure in the glass. Sometimes, late at night, if I pass by the office door, I sense a faint heaviness. like someone could be standing by the window. The new desk position means I no longer see my reflection there, and that helps. But I still remember what it felt like to see that shape behind me, unmoving, as if it was part of my reflection. It makes my skin crawl. I haven't told many people about it, because I'm not sure how to explain it without sounding irrational, but I know what I saw. Now I keep a small nightlight in the office, so the window never reflects total darkness. I also avoid glancing at my reflection for too long, especially after midnight. My sleep patterns have changed, and I try to finish my work before the evening. If I catch myself working late, a wave of anxiety sets in. The memory of that figure is enough to make me close my computer and leave the room. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed seated and watched it over my shoulder. Would it have moved closer? Would it have disappeared? I don't want to find out. For now, I'm just glad that in daylight, everything looks normal. But once the sun sets, I can't help feeling that if I stare into that window glass again, I might see it standing behind me once more, silent and dark, waiting for me to notice it. I was never the type of person who believed in ghosts or strange sightings on deserted roads. I used to handle long drives without thinking about anything other than getting home as fast as possible. But one night, I had an experience on a back road near Willow Creek, Oregon, that changed the way I feel about driving alone. I want to describe it from start to finish, as clearly as I can, so you understand why I avoid that route now. That evening, I was driving back from a business trip. It was late. I'd been on the road all day, and most of my usual route was under construction. I decided to take a detour through a secondary highway. The GPS showed it would save me a little time. I knew it would be dark, but I figured it would be faster than dealing with traffic and reduced lanes on the main freeway. I noticed right away how empty this particular highway felt. There were tall pines on both sides, and I didn't see any buildings or lights in the distance. My headlights illuminated the asphalt directly in front of me, but beyond that, I saw only darkness. Occasionally the road curved, and I found myself switching to high beams just to make sure I wasn't missing any sharp turns. My eyes felt heavy. I tried rolling down the window to get some fresh air. The wind coming in was cool, but not refreshing enough to keep my eyelids from wanting to close. I turned on the radio, but most stations gave me static. Eventually, I found something faint. It was a talk show, but the signal kept dropping. After a few minutes, I gave up and shut it off. At this point, I realized I hadn't seen another car for at least 20 minutes. My mind drifted to small tasks waiting for me at home. I just wanted to get there. Suddenly, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I noticed something on the shoulder of the road behind me. At first, I assumed it was a road sign or maybe an old mailbox. It was shaped like a hunched figure, but I wasn't completely sure because my view was quick and the lighting was poor. I started questioning myself. Did I see a person? Could someone be walking out there? I slowed down a bit, unsure if I should stop or not. I caught another glimpse in the mirror. The figure appeared to be wearing dark clothing. I couldn't see a face. Its posture looked strange, as if it was leaning forward, waiting. My arms felt tense on the steering wheel. My skin prickled along my neck. The idea of someone standing there so late made me uneasy, but I pressed on, telling myself that maybe they'd had car trouble or were a hitchhiker. I decided to keep moving. There was no shoulder wide enough for me to pull over safely, and I didn't want to risk a confrontation in the dark. A few miles later, I checked my mirror again. Empty highway, no lights. The lines in the road kept passing beneath my car's headlights, but everything else seemed pitch black. Then, As I turned a gentle curve, I saw the same figure on the shoulder ahead of me, this time on the passenger side, but closer to the road. My breath caught in my throat. I knew there was no way that person could have gotten there before me. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't taken any detour. There was no shortcut, but it looked exactly like the same dark shape, the same hunched position, the same lack of movement. I drove past it slowly. My heart was pounding, and my palms were sweaty on the wheel. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd seen a tree stump that looked like a person. I forced myself to glance out the passenger window. I saw arms hanging at the sides. I couldn't see a face. I looked forward again and accelerated. I thought about calling someone just to calm myself down, but the phone signal was almost non-existent in that area. I tried it anyway. No bars, just an emergency calls icon. I put the phone aside, stared at the road, and told myself to keep going. The tension in my shoulders got worse with each mile. Suddenly, the car jolted, as if I'd run over a rock. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to jerk my head forward. My stomach twisted. I kept my foot on the gas, not wanting to pull over. I couldn't even tell what I'd hit. All I knew was I didn't want to stop on that highway. The trees on both sides seemed taller, as if they were closing in. I felt trapped. My eyes went back to the mirror, and I nearly gasped when I saw a quick movement behind the car. I couldn't make out a shape clearly, but I was sure something was there for a second, then it was gone. The next time I looked ahead, I caught sight of that same figure standing near the center line, about 50 yards away. It wasn't exactly on the road, but it was close. My chest tightened. I slowed down, scared that I might hit it, but also terrified of getting too close. As I approached, the figure didn't move. I tried to see any detail, face, eyes, mouth, nothing. It was like a tall shadow with a slight bend at the shoulders. I honked, hoping it might move aside. It did nothing. I swerved slightly to avoid it, but when I glanced out my window, it wasn't there. My jaw felt clenched, and my heart was going too fast. I accelerated, deciding I needed to get out of that area quickly. The engine hummed louder. My tires rumbled against the aging asphalt. The memory of that shape lingered in my mind. I wiped sweat from my forehead. I could taste salt on my lips. My breathing was shallow. My logical side told me to keep driving until I reached a town or a gas station. But part of me wanted to turn back and confirm I wasn't hallucinating. My anxiety won out. I kept going. After another 10 or 15 minutes, I spotted lights in the distance. They were faint, but they looked like the glow of a convenience store or some kind of roadside stop. Relief washed over me. My arms relaxed a little. I pressed the accelerator more, determined to reach those lights. Then, as if the world wanted to test me again, my radio popped to life with a burst of static. I tried switching channels, but everything was static. It was like a wall of white noise. There was no comfort in it. I gripped the steering wheel with one hand, turned off the radio, and exhaled. My breath came out shaky. That's when I saw the figure again, far ahead, still on the shoulder. I knew this was no coincidence or trick of the eye. My stomach churned. I felt a sharp jolt of panic shoot through my chest. My thoughts jumped to bizarre possibilities. Could it be a real person playing a game? Could it be something else? I didn't know. I just felt my face getting hot and my hands getting damp. When I passed by that spot, there was nothing. My headlights revealed an empty stretch of gravel and weeds. But I could sense something in the air. My hairs stood up and my throat felt dry. I swallowed, but it felt like a rock was lodged there. I pressed on until I finally reached a small gas station with a single row of pumps and a flickering neon sign. I parked and cut the engine. My hands were shaking as I took the keys out of the ignition. I hurried inside. The fluorescent lights inside the store felt harsh, but I was glad to be in a lit place with another human being. A tired-looking attendant stood behind the counter, sipping coffee. I asked him if he'd seen anyone on the highway tonight. He frowned and said he'd been there all evening, and no one else had come through. He admitted that foot traffic was rare in that area. Most people took the main road. I asked if he'd at least heard of other sightings. He just shrugged. I could feel my heart pounding as I described what I saw. The man gave me a puzzled look and shook his head. Then he said, "Maybe I was just tired." I didn't argue. I bought a bottle of water and stepped outside again, looking at the empty highway. The air felt still. My body felt tense and tired, like I'd been clenching every muscle for hours. I took a few swigs of water, breathing in and out. For a moment, I thought about staying there until sunrise, but the station had no motel rooms, and the cashier said he'd be closing in a couple of hours. I didn't want to be stuck outside in my car, especially not on that road. I decided to go back the way I came. I reasoned that if I'd seen that shape in front of me, maybe it was only on that side of the highway. I felt uneasy about it, but I couldn't sit there all night. I got in the car, turned on the engine, and set off in the opposite direction. The attendant locked the door behind me. I glanced in the mirror. My own eyes looked wide with fear. I drove slowly, scanning the sides of the road. The darkness felt thick again, and my heart rate picked up. My headlights carved two pale cones in front of me, but everything else was pitch black. I considered calling the police, but then realized I'd have to explain that I saw a mysterious figure on a deserted road. The thought made me uneasy. I kept driving. After a few miles, I spotted something on the shoulder again. My chest tightened. I pressed my foot on the brake, easing to a crawl. In my headlights, I saw the figure one more time, standing still. This time, it was under the pale moonlight, so I could make out a bit more detail. It wore dark clothes. I couldn't see a face. It stood with its head lowered, arms hanging. My pulse thudded in my ears. My mouth felt dry, and I tasted bitterness on my tongue. Part of me wanted to stop and confront it, but a stronger part told me to keep driving. I started to accelerate, but I almost stopped breathing when the shape seemed to turn slightly, as though it was reacting to my presence. I felt a chill run from the base of my spine to my shoulders. My hands trembled on the wheel. I looked at the fuel gauge. It was still okay, so I had no reason to stop. I pressed the pedal harder, and the tires kicked up a bit of gravel. In my rearview mirror, I saw an empty road. I didn't slow down for a long time, only adjusting my speed for curves or spots where the pavement was rough. My throat hurt, and my chest felt tight from holding my breath so often. I was worried about deer or wildlife crossing, but my main fear was seeing that figure again. Every time I passed a mile marker, I let out a forced exhale. My body was running on pure adrenaline. Finally, I reached a more familiar highway. I saw a few cars and some distant streetlights. I felt a huge wave of relief. My shoulders slumped. My grip on the steering wheel loosened. The tension in my jaw started to ease, although my heart was still pounding. I turned onto a larger road, and after about an hour, I saw the lights of a small town. I pulled into an all-night diner parking lot, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a few minutes. I rubbed my eyes. They felt gritty, and my temples were throbbing. My mind kept going back to that shape on the road. I went inside, found a seat by the window, and tried to focus on the normal sounds: people talking, dishes clanking, a muffled radio playing pop music. It felt unreal compared to what I had just experienced. My skin was still covered in a thin layer of sweat, and my breathing was uneven. I ordered a coffee, drank it fast, and then ordered another. The waitress asked if I was okay. I just said I'd had a long drive. By the time I got home later that night, the sky was turning pale. I parked the car, walked inside, and sat on my couch. My head pounded, and I couldn't stop replaying each moment. I kept thinking about how I saw that figure multiple times in places that didn't make sense. My fingers trembled when I tried to check my phone. The battery was almost dead, and it showed no missed calls or texts. Everything felt unsettling. That experience changed me. I promised myself I wouldn't take deserted roads alone at night anymore. To this day, I'm not sure what I saw. I've had nightmares about it. I wake up feeling the same jolt of fear. I still have no logical explanation, but I know it felt real. I know the roads around Willow Creek are different at night. Something roams there, or at least it did on that night, and I never want to see it again. I moved to Albany because I needed a job, and I found a small studio on the second floor of an old brick building near downtown. It was apartment 212. The place was worn but affordable. I was relieved to finally settle somewhere. My first night there was calm, except for a slight feeling that something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I chalked it up to nerves and went to bed. On my second day, I was unpacking boxes in the late afternoon. I remember seeing my reflection in the window. It was the only large window in the place, looking out onto a street where an old commercial building stood across from me. The building was closed by then, so there were no lights or visible activity. As I unpacked, I noticed a strange shape behind my own reflection, like someone standing back there. I turned around, but there was nobody in the room. My stomach knotted for a second, but I told myself it was a weird light trick. Over the next couple of days, I kept glancing at that window. It was about 5 feet wide and let in most of the natural light. I'd catch a movement in the corner of my eye. When I looked, I'd see a form in the glass, as if a person was standing behind me. I was sure I was alone. Sometimes I'd spin around, expecting to see a friend who might have snuck in, but the studio was empty. At first, the reflection looked like a hazy outline, but by the end of the week, it grew more defined. It had the basic shape of an adult, somewhere around my height, with the outline of shoulders. There were no clear facial details. It was like a silhouette. I started feeling tense whenever I entered that part of the room. My shoulders would tighten, and I'd get a chill. I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if there was something wrong with that window. One afternoon, I tried recording a video with my phone. I set it up on a bookshelf aimed at the window, then walked around, trying to replicate what I'd seen. I made sure to stand in different positions so the camera would catch the reflection from various angles. When I watched the footage later, there was nothing. I saw my own reflection, but no second shape. My chest felt tight, and my hands shook. I couldn't figure out why I could see it in person, but not on the recording. I started sleeping on my couch in the main living area, away from the window. The apartment was small, so it wasn't a big distance, but it felt safer. I noticed that whenever I walked into the bedroom section, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I could almost sense that shape behind me. I'd look in the mirror or in the window, and sometimes it was there, faintly. It became impossible to relax. I mentioned it to the building superintendent, a man named Mr. Gonzalez. He was an older guy who oversaw repairs and basic upkeep. I asked him if anyone had reported weird reflections in their windows. He frowned, said he hadn't heard anything. He offered to come check out the room with me. We stood by the window, talked for a bit. He looked at the glass and just shrugged, saying, "I don't see anything." He suggested I might be stressed or homesick. I felt embarrassed. I thanked him, and he left. As soon as he was gone, I tried shutting the blinds. The problem was, I only had a flimsy mini blind that didn't block much, so I bought a thick, dark blanket, nailed it over the window frame, and hoped that would solve the problem. At night, the blanket helped me feel safer for a while, but after a day or two, I still felt uneasy. I'd walk into the room and sense eyes on me. The moment I uncovered the window, I'd see that faint silhouette again. I started losing sleep. My appetite dropped. I'd hear my own pulse in my ears when I stepped near that side of the apartment. Sometimes I felt like the temperature in the bedroom area was lower, even though I kept the thermostat at the same level for the entire place. I checked for drafts or cracks in the frame, but found nothing. It felt like the air itself was colder near the window. One night I woke up around 2 a.m. I couldn't sleep. My anxiety was through the roof. I decided I needed to face whatever was in that window. I walked into the room, pulled down the blanket, and stared at the glass. The street was dark outside. The commercial building opposite mine had no lights. I could see my reflection clearly. Then, to my left in the reflection, I saw that figure again. It was right behind me. My stomach flipped. My breathing got shallow. My eyes stung. I wanted to turn around, but I was terrified of what I'd see. My muscles tensed so hard that my legs started to shake. I slowly turned my head. There was nothing there, but in the reflection, the shape still stood behind me. It looked like it was leaning closer, as though it might reach me at any second. I let out a muffled cry and stumbled backward. My back hit a table, and a small lamp fell over. I ran out of that room, slammed the door, and threw myself onto the couch, my heart hammering. My entire body tingled, and my palms felt clammy. The next day, I tried to approach it more calmly. I decided to stay out of the bedroom unless I absolutely had to go in. I began leaving that door closed at all times. I'd slip in quickly to grab clothes or any items I needed, then hurry out. Each time, I felt eyes on me. The reflection was always there in the glass, watching. Even when I tried to ignore it, I could sense it in the corner of my vision. I bought a second-hand dresser and moved it near the window to block it physically. The top of the dresser came about halfway up the glass, so part of the window was still exposed. That night, I pushed the dresser even closer, hoping to obstruct the shape. I felt desperate. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. Maybe I was stressed from the big move, from job hunting, from being alone in a new city. But every time I left the room, I walked away feeling unsettled. I decided to call my cousin, the only family member I had in the state, and asked if she could come by. She arrived that evening, and I showed her the room. At first, she just looked out the window and said, "It seems fine." Then I told her to stand with me and look at our reflections. She nodded and said she didn't see anything unusual. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat tighten. I insisted that I'd been seeing something. She told me to try to relax, that maybe it was a trick of the light bouncing off the building outside. For a moment, I hoped she was right. After she left, though, I saw it again, clearer than before. That shape was about a foot behind my reflection, head level with mine. I remember feeling my skin prickle. My breath came out in a trembling sigh. I pulled the blanket over the window again and secured it as tightly as I could. Then I yanked the door shut and locked it. I spent the night tossing and turning on the couch, jumpy at every creak in the building. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted. I forced myself to do normal chores and errands. I tried to stay out until the sun went down, hoping that when I got back, I'd be too tired to care about that window. That plan failed. The moment I stepped into the apartment, I felt the tension return. It was as if the entire space wanted me to check the bedroom. I resisted for a few hours, watching TV with the volume turned up to drown out my thoughts. Eventually, around 11 p.m., I felt compelled to look. I couldn't sleep knowing that I might see something if I did. I went in, turned on the overhead light, and slowly pulled the blanket down. I tried to stand at an angle where I wouldn't see my reflection directly. But it didn't matter. The second I looked, that silhouette was in the glass. This time, it seemed bigger, or maybe my nerves were making it seem that way. My heart pounded so hard, I thought I might pass out. I stepped forward, wanting to see if it would move. It stayed put. My brain screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt heavy. I gripped the windowsill, my knuckles turning white. I thought about smashing the window, but I didn't want to pay for damages or get in trouble with the landlord. Instead, I flicked off the light to see if it changed anything. In the darkness, the silhouette became more apparent, because now the reflection was darker. I swear it felt closer to me. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and my mouth went dry. I snapped the light back on, pinned the blanket up, and rushed out. I locked the bedroom door and slid down the hallway wall, shaking. I could hardly breathe. My chest felt tight, and my head spun. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Gonzalez again. It was late, so I just left a message asking if there was any prior tenant who complained about something in that window. I rambled, my voice trembling. When I hung up, I realized I'd sounded panicked. He never got back to me about that message. I suspect he thought I was delusional. I couldn't function in that apartment. I started sleeping fewer and fewer hours each night. Every time I tried to rest, my thoughts drifted to that reflection. I even began imagining it sliding out of the window and lurking around the apartment. The sense of dread was overwhelming. After about 2 weeks, I decided I couldn't keep living there. It wasn't worth it, new job or not. I packed my things in a hurry, shoving clothes into boxes without folding them. I left the bed frame behind because I couldn't deal with disassembling it in that room. On my last night, I kept checking the time, counting down the hours until I could leave at sunrise. That morning, I stacked my boxes in the car. My back ached from the strain, and I was sweating even though it was cool outside. I went back for one final sweep, just to make sure I wasn't leaving anything important. I stood in the doorway to the bedroom. My heart thumped. I pulled the blanket off the window, telling myself I'd throw it out. When I did, I saw my reflection one final time. The silhouette was there, unmoving. I felt goosebumps spread across my arms. My breath caught in my throat. I dropped the blanket and backed away, closing the door. I left the key with the superintendent's office and drove off. I felt lightheaded, like I was finally escaping a bad dream. Even while I was relieved, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that shape behind me. My shoulders were so tense that they ached for hours. That day, I moved in with a friend while I searched for a different apartment. I never bothered to ask for my deposit back. I just wanted to forget about that window. To this day, I don't know what I saw or why it only appeared when I was alone. Maybe the window had some kind of flaw, or maybe it was something else. All I know is I felt genuinely afraid in that space. The figure never spoke, it never left the glass, but it felt menacing. I can't explain it. I'm just glad I got out before it drove me completely insane. Sometimes, at night, I wonder if whoever moved in after me ended up seeing that same reflection. But I'll never go back to find out. I never expected to find a hidden attic in my new house, but when I moved into a two-story home in Derry Heights, Maine, I discovered a small, concealed trap door in the ceiling during renovation. At first, I felt a burst of excitement because I'd always liked exploring old spaces. The house seemed charming from the outside, with its faded green paint and porch swing. I figured there might be some interesting history tucked away in the rafters. I had no idea it would become the source of so many restless nights. I remember that day in clear detail. I was pulling down some outdated wallpaper in the upstairs hallway and noticed a faint outline in the ceiling. It looked like a square hatch, but it had been plastered over or painted to blend in. It definitely wasn't shown in any of the house's paperwork. Curiosity got the better of me, so I used a ladder to tap around the ceiling. I felt a hollow echo above one spot. I grabbed a flashlight and a small crowbar, then carefully pried the edges. The panel popped open with a dull crack. Dust rained down on my hair and shoulders, and I coughed. My heart thudded with anticipation. I shone my flashlight into the darkness. The space looked tight, with beams and old insulation. I couldn't see much, so I went to the garage, grabbed a rickety stepladder, and set it under the newly opened hatch. Climbing up, I poked my head inside. The air smelled stale and thick. I saw spider webs clinging to the rafters. I could just barely make out what looked like old furniture marks pressed into the dust. But there was no actual furniture there. I figured it was just a forgotten storage area. Still, I felt uneasy. The place was cramped, the ceiling low, and the corners hidden in shadow. I didn't linger. I climbed back down and decided I'd properly check it some other time. My main focus was finishing the wallpaper removal. That night, though, I heard the first noises. It was around 11 p.m. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard what sounded like a faint scraping overhead. It lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds. I held my breath and listened. The house was quiet. Then, nothing more. I tried to tell myself it was just normal settling or a branch scraping the roof. But a knot formed in my stomach. My eyes stayed wide open for a long time. Over the following days, I continued my renovation work. Each evening, I'd hear more noises above me, soft thuds or creaks. It felt like something was shifting in the attic, but I couldn't figure out what. One day, I checked that area for any signs of rodents. I climbed the ladder again with traps and a flashlight. I shone the light around. The beams looked intact. No visible nests or droppings. No holes in the roof. The space was mostly dust and cobwebs. I didn't see anything alive. I spent maybe 5 minutes up there. I felt an odd pressure in the air, like I wasn't alone, though I saw nothing that would explain it. Once I'd placed a few traps, I sealed the trap door from the inside, pressing it shut. Then I nailed it down with a few small nails, hoping to keep any animals or pests out of my main living area. That night, I crawled into bed feeling somewhat relieved, as if I had contained the problem. But around 2 a.m., a series of sharp popping sounds echoed overhead. My heart skipped a beat. I switched on the bedside lamp and stared at the ceiling. It felt like something heavy was shifting up there. The noise happened again, and my pulse sped up. I could feel my chest tighten. I told myself I was just spooking myself over random house noises. Still, I ended up lying awake until sunrise. The next morning, I decided I needed more evidence of what was happening. I had an old camera that recorded video, so I thought I'd set it up in the attic overnight. I climbed back up with the camera, found a flat beam to rest it on, and pressed record. Then I left it running and closed the hatch. My plan was to let it record all night and check the footage the next day. I slept on the couch downstairs because the bedroom was starting to make me feel uneasy. The night was restless. I thought I heard faint noises from upstairs, but nothing as loud as before. In the morning, I retrieved the camera. My fingers trembled a little when I turned it off, my mind racing about what I might find. I took it downstairs, plugged it into my laptop, and watched. The screen was mostly dark. Once in a while the camera picked up a small click or scratching sound, but I couldn't see anything. The only clear thing I heard was a quiet rustling, almost like fabric moving against wood. No sign of animals or anything else. But hearing that sound, like something brushing across the beams, made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the kind of noise I associate with rodents. It sounded more deliberate. Over the next week, my sleep deteriorated. Every night, I'd hear movement or soft bumps above me. Some nights, it was quiet, and I'd start to relax. Then, just as I dozed off, a sudden scrape would jolt me awake. My nerves felt frayed. My eyes had dark circles. During the day, I kept trying to do normal tasks, painting walls, fixing old light fixtures, but my mind would wander to the attic. Sometimes I'd notice the trap door, the nails I'd hammered in, and see that one corner looked slightly raised, as if it had been pried from the inside. That made my heart pound. I bought extra nails and screws. I climbed up on a ladder and fastened that door as tightly as I could, driving in screws along the edges. My hands shook as I did it. I almost dropped the screwdriver a few times. By the time I finished, the panel felt solid. I tested it, pushing from below, and it didn't budge. I went to bed that night thinking I'd feel more at ease. But the noises continued. I heard a soft thudding, then it went quiet. In the morning, I checked the trap door and saw that one of the screws was loose. The threads had stripped, as if too much pressure had been applied from the other side. I felt a chill run over my arms and neck. I decided to call a professional to check for any hidden damage. Maybe there was a structural issue causing these sounds, or so I tried to rationalize. I hired a local handyman named Mark. He came over, climbed up there for a quick inspection, and said the rafters looked okay, no water damage, no sign of a big rodent infestation. But he did say something weird. The space seemed larger than it appeared from the hatch. He noticed a partial wall, almost like a partition, that blocked off part of the attic. He didn't want to crawl behind it because there was barely any clearance and a lot of dusty insulation. But the idea of more hidden space made me uneasy. If something was behind that wall, it could explain the sounds. Mark told me he'd come back with more gear if I wanted to tear down the partition, but I hesitated. That night, heavy rain fell. The wind rattled the windows and thunder rumbled every few minutes. I sat in the living room, watching TV with low volume, trying to distract myself. The lights flickered a couple of times, which made me more anxious. Suddenly, a loud scrape came from upstairs, followed by 3 distinct thumps. I froze. My stomach lurched. The storm was loud, but these sounds stood out. I walked to the bottom of the stairs, heart pounding. The hallway upstairs was dark. Another thump echoed. It sounded so close, like something was being dragged across the floor. My skin prickled. My head felt hot, and my hands turned cold. I grabbed a flashlight and forced myself to go up. My legs felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. I could hear rain hammering the roof above me. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the hallway for a split second. I saw the trap door. It looked slightly ajar at one corner. My breath caught in my throat. I had screwed it shut, so it shouldn't be open at all. I swallowed hard. My mind told me to back away, but I felt a surge of anger and fear. I couldn't stand living like this anymore. I needed to see what was going on. I retrieved a hammer and used the stepladder to push the panel all the way open. Rain beat down on the roof. I aimed my flashlight into the attic and saw dust particles swirl in the beam. My heart thumped so loudly I could hear it over the storm. I pulled myself up slowly. The space felt claustrophobic. I crouched, shining the light around. My voice shook when I called out, "Is anyone here?" No answer, just the rattling of rain and wind. I stepped carefully onto a plank. Something brushed my shoulder, and I gasped. It was just a cobweb. Then I felt a slight shift of air behind me, like someone moving. I spun around, almost dropping the flashlight. Nothing was there. My breathing was ragged, and my fingers shook. I glanced at the partial wall that Mark had mentioned. It was maybe 3 feet high, running between beams. The top of it was just a piece of plywood hammered in place. Another flash of lightning brightened the attic. I thought I saw a slight movement, like a shape darting behind the partition. Fear shot through my gut. I moved toward the opening. My flashlight flickered, probably due to low battery or the humidity. I tried to hold it steady. When I reached the partition, a sudden gust seemed to blow right past me. It felt cold and made the hairs on my arms stand up. I yelled out of shock, stumbled backward, and nearly lost my balance on the beam. My heartbeat hammered in my ears. The attic floor vibrated under me, or maybe that was just my trembling legs. I hurried back to the hatch, clutching the flashlight in a white-knuckled grip. I climbed down, nearly missing the last rung. Once my feet hit the hallway floor, I slammed the panel shut and grabbed the hammer. My hands moved on their own, banging nails in, not caring if I damaged the ceiling. I hammered until the edges were splintered, and I was sure it wouldn't open again. I stood there, panting, my heart still racing. The storm kept raging outside. I retreated to the living room, sank onto the couch, and tried to steady my breathing. I kept waiting for another thump or scrape, but the house was silent except for the wind and rain. My nerves were shot. I didn't sleep at all that night. Over the next few days, the noises became less frequent. Maybe my overkill approach sealed the hatch. But every now and then, I'd catch a faint scratch or a subtle creak, as if something still shifted up there. It never escalated to the same intensity again, but I couldn't relax. Whenever I looked up at the ceiling in the hallway, I felt a surge of dread. My mind would replay that moment in the attic, the sensation of something moving behind me. I eventually decided I couldn't live with that tension. I ended up hammering the panel shut from the outside with heavy boards, ensuring it was impossible to open easily. I covered the nails with putty, painted over them, and tried to forget the attic existed. The noises faded a little more, but sometimes late at night, I'd hear a faint scuttling or a muffled sound above the bedroom ceiling. I told myself it was just the old house settling, but I never climbed up there again. The memory of that cold rush of air and the feeling that something was standing behind me still makes my skin crawl. To this day, I live with a sense of unease. I keep waiting for the next time I hear a strange bump in the night. I tell people the house has a sealed attic, and I don't encourage them to open it. If someone asks about it, I just say it's unsafe. But the truth is, I'm afraid. I still wonder what's behind that partition. Maybe there's nothing. Maybe it was all my imagination. But part of me knows there was something else up there, something that didn't want me poking around, something that still waits in the darkness, behind those dusty beams, silent and patient. And that's why I avoid the attic altogether. I used to love the quiet after midnight. I worked as a freelance designer, and those late hours helped me focus. My Memphis apartment was small and warm, usually silent except for the hum of my computer. That changed one night when I felt a slight touch on my shoulder around 2 a.m. At first, I thought it was my hair brushing against my skin or the fabric of my sweater. But the touch felt more deliberate, like a gentle tap. I turned around fast, heart pounding. There was nobody behind me. My chair squeaked on the hardwood floor as I pushed it back. I stood up, looked around the living room, checked the small kitchen corner, then the hallway leading to the bedroom. Everything was empty and still. My pulse throbbed in my ears. I told myself I was just tired. For the next few nights, I tried to brush it off as my imagination. I stayed up working on design projects, editing images, answering emails. My apartment was on the third floor of an older building in Memphis, with thick walls that blocked outside noise. I rarely heard my neighbors, but around the same time each night, usually between 2 and 3 a.m., I felt that same sensation, a light pressure on my shoulder or upper arm, as if fingers were trying to get my attention. Sometimes I'd catch it out of the corner of my eye, like a small blur in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned fully, the room was empty. My nerves started to wear thin. I noticed I was getting jumpy whenever the clock neared 2 a.m. I'd keep checking the time, dreading that familiar feeling. One night I decided to keep my headphones off, hoping I could catch some hint of a sound or movement. Usually I listened to music while working, but this time I worked in silence. At around 2:15 a.m., I heard a faint whisper, like a muffled voice coming from behind me. It was too quiet to make out the words. I spun my chair around so fast that I almost fell off. My eyes darted to every corner of the apartment. Nothing. My hands were shaking, and my throat felt dry. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical reason for these sensations. Maybe an air current from the heater. Maybe my building had old vents that carried faint sounds from other apartments. I tried to confirm that theory by checking the air vents, running my hand near each one. The airflow was minimal. I put my ear to the walls, listening for pipes or creaking, but I couldn't replicate the whisper. My unease grew. 2 nights later, I felt that tap again. My heart sped up, and I pulled off my headphones. That's when I heard a soft voice whisper what sounded like Olivia, my name. It was so quiet, but I recognized it immediately. My face went hot. My stomach twisted. I stood up, my legs tense. I shouted, "Who's there?" My voice echoed in the silence. No answer. I walked around the apartment, flipping on every light, checking the bathroom, even opening the closet. Nothing. I locked the front door, though it was already locked. I checked the windows. They were latched. I was alone, but I kept hearing that faint whisper in my head. The next day, I tried to be rational. I thought maybe it was stress or some half-dream state from working too late. Still, I decided to run an audio recording on my phone in the background while I worked at night. If there was a weird interference or a neighbor calling my name, the phone might catch it. The first night I recorded, I heard nothing unusual. The second night, though, I played back the audio the next morning and heard a low hiss around 2:30 a.m. Then a faint exhale, like someone breathing out in frustration. My scalp tingled. My mouth went dry. I replayed that section over and over, trying to make sense of it. It sounded too close to be a neighbor and too quiet to be a random noise from the street. It felt directed at me. I called a few neighbors to see if anyone was messing around or had visitors who might be talking late at night. They all said no. One person said they slept with earplugs and never heard a thing. Another said they sometimes heard a cat in the alley, but that was it. Nobody admitted to hearing voices. That unsettled me more. By the end of that week, the whispering started happening more frequently. Sometimes it would say my name. Other times it would murmur short phrases I couldn't fully understand. It sounded like a man's voice, deep and strained. I tried to catch more of it on my phone's recorder. In one file, I heard something like help or hello, but it was distorted. I showed it to a friend of mine who dabbled in sound mixing, and he said it sounded like a voice layered under static. He couldn't clean it up enough to reveal clear words. Every night, I found myself dreading those early morning hours. My body would tense up as 2 a.m. approached. Sometimes I'd try to stay awake and keep the apartment brightly lit. Other times I'd put on loud music to drown out any potential noises, but I still felt the tap on my shoulder. Even with the music turned up, I sensed that presence behind me. The fear took a toll on my work. I started missing deadlines because I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept drifting to the possibility that something was in the apartment with me. One night, I snapped. I was exhausted, and the whisper came again around 2:20 a.m. It said my name more urgently, Olivia. My ears rang. My chest tightened. I stood up, spun around, and shouted, "Leave me alone." My voice sounded shaky. That's when I heard a rapid scratching sound behind my desk. It sounded like nails on the drywall. I froze, my body rigid. I couldn't move for a few seconds, just listening. The scratching stopped, and the room felt heavier, like the air was thicker. I grabbed my keys and phone, hurried out the door without turning off any lights, and ran down the hallway to the stairwell. I sat on the steps, trembling, my hand pressed to my chest as I tried to steady my breathing. I stayed away from the apartment for a few hours, walking around the block until the sun started to rise. I picked up coffee at a 24-hour diner and sat there, trying to calm down. I debated whether to call the police, but I had no evidence of an intruder. I could only say I heard noises. After sunrise, I went back. The lights were still on, and everything looked normal, but the atmosphere felt wrong. My skin prickled. I could almost feel something watching me. I tried to ignore it, took a shower, and tried to sleep for a few hours in the morning. Over the next few nights, I switched my schedule. I tried to work during the day and sleep at normal hours. But living as a freelancer meant I sometimes had to pull late nights. I started noticing that the voice or the tapping would only happen when I was awake around 2 or 3 a.m. If I managed to sleep before that time, I sometimes woke up to faint scratching on the walls. My heart would pound, and I'd hide under the covers, waiting for it to stop. I told a friend about the possibility of a pipe or ventilation issue. She suggested I talk to the building manager. I did, explaining that I was hearing strange sounds. The manager checked the building's maintenance logs. No complaints from other tenants about weird noises. He assured me that the building was well insulated and that there shouldn't be any problems with cross-ventilation or old pipes. He offered to do a quick inspection of my apartment, so he came up one afternoon. We walked around, tapped on walls, listened. Nothing. He left, looking puzzled. I decided to try more aggressive methods. I placed small cameras in the living room and bedroom, pointed toward my desk area where I usually sat. I let them run at night. The next morning, I checked the footage. The living room feed showed me sitting at the desk. Then, around 2:05 a.m., I watched myself jerk my head around, apparently reacting to the whisper. But the camera audio didn't pick up anything except faint static. I saw my shoulders tense. I stood up and walked a few steps away. Then I froze, turned back, and looked near the wall. But again, the camera didn't show anything unusual. No movement or shadows. I felt helpless. One night my nerves got the best of me, and I ended up screaming at the empty apartment, telling whatever was there to leave, to stop tormenting me. I heard a quick shuffle behind the couch. My brain flooded with panic. My limbs tingled, and I ran into the hallway again. By this point, my neighbors probably thought I was having some kind of emotional breakdown. I stayed in the hallway for a while, breathing heavily. Nobody came out to check on me, which made me feel more isolated. Eventually, I decided to alter my life completely. I started going to bed around 11 p.m. and waking up before sunrise to do my design work. I bought bright lamps and filled the apartment with as much light as possible during the late evening hours, hoping the presence or whatever it was wouldn't appear in a fully lit environment. The tapping didn't go away entirely, but it became less frequent. Still, I felt on edge. My muscles stayed tense, and I slept lightly, listening for any noise. One of the scariest moments happened when I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth around midnight. I heard a soft whisper from behind the door, my name again, barely audible. My hands shook, and I dropped the toothbrush in the sink. I swung open the door. Nothing. My eyes watered from fear, and my breath came in short gasps. I hurried to my bedroom, shut the door, and turned on a small fan to create some white noise. I curled up under the covers, shaking. I never found a solid explanation for these events. I told a few close friends and family members. Some suggested I see a therapist. Others mentioned the possibility of a haunting, which made me uncomfortable. I didn't want to believe something unexplainable was latched onto my apartment, but I couldn't deny what I was hearing and feeling. After months of this pattern, my lease was almost up, and I chose not to renew. I felt exhausted and paranoid. Even though the voice never harmed me physically, it drained me. I wanted out. I packed up in a hurry, loading my car with boxes, and moved to a different part of Memphis, where I found a smaller studio. On my last day in that old place, I walked through each room, checking for anything I might have left behind. I paused at the spot near my desk, remembering all those nights. My chest tightened again, and I felt like the air was heavier. I left without looking back. In my new apartment, I never experienced those whispers or taps again. I started sleeping better. I slowly returned to a normal schedule. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the hush of that old living room in Memphis and the way something called my name. My pulse speeds up just remembering it. To this day, I avoid working past midnight if I can. I don't wear my headphones for hours on end anymore. I keep the space bright. I keep music playing in the background. I do whatever it takes to avoid silence during those early hours. I don't know who or what was trying to get my attention, but I'm relieved to be away from that apartment and whatever lingered there. I remember the drive to Flathead Lake in Montana as a mix of excitement and nerves. Connor and I wanted an escape from the usual tourist spots. We heard stories about the mountains there, about quiet trails and clear skies. We chose a remote path, hoping to find the kind of solitude we couldn't get in regular campgrounds. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting behind the tree line, and we felt a chill in the air. We found a dry lake bed surrounded by old pines. The ground was covered with white stones that crunched under our boots. It looked almost lifeless, with no water and only a faint breeze rustling the trees. We parked the truck at the edge of this dry basin. There were no other vehicles around, no signs of other campers. The silence felt complete, with only our own steps and breathing for company. We pitched our tent side by side on a flat spot near a few large boulders. Connor joked about how still everything was, saying we might as well have been on the moon. I laughed at first, but I noticed the hair on my arms standing up. I blamed the cold, but there was something about that place that made me uneasy. Once we had everything set up, we made a small fire. The flames flickered, sending sparks into the darkening sky. We ate sandwiches and sipped from our water bottles. It was too silent for my taste. Usually you hear birds or small animals at dusk. but I didn't hear anything except the crackle of the fire. Connor commented that it was the quietest campsite he'd ever seen. I shrugged and suggested we turn in early so we could explore the area the next day. We sat by the fire a bit longer, talking about our old road trips. Then Connor pointed out small flashes of light at the far side of the dry lake bed near the tree line. At first, I thought it might be the reflection of our fire on something, but these lights were far away and faint, more like flickers. They moved in short bursts, sometimes disappearing, then reappearing in a different spot. We both strained our eyes, trying to see if it was someone with a flashlight. There was no sound of footsteps or voices, just the occasional flicker. It felt odd. The pit of my stomach tightened. We decided not to wander off in the dark, so we doused the fire and climbed into our tents. I tried to sleep, but my mind replayed those flickers of light. Every so often I heard the faint crunch of gravel outside, like something shifting. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe some small animal. Eventually, I drifted off. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a bright glow penetrating my tent walls. My first thought was morning light, but it was too strong and pure white. My heart pounded. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The moment I looked out, I saw a ball of light hovering maybe 30 yards away, just above the ground. It moved slowly, almost gliding. I froze. My mouth went dry, and my mind scrambled for logical explanations. Swamp gas, a reflection from something. But there was no water, no sign of man-made objects. The light moved across the stony surface without a sound. I called Connor's name. He stirred in his tent, and I heard him unzip the flap. He stuck his head out, saw the light, and gasped. We both crawled out, standing there in our pajamas, the cold biting at our skin. A second ball of light joined the first, farther off to the left. My pulse raced as I watched them drift near the tree line, then vanish behind the trunks. We grabbed flashlights and walked a few steps away from our tents. The ground felt uneven beneath my boots. I kept scanning the area with my flashlight, hoping to see a clue, maybe a person holding a lantern. But the beams of our flashlights revealed only shrubs, rocks, and dirt. We didn't hear any movement. The silence pressed in on us. I felt my temples throbbing. Connor suggested we try to follow them. I wasn't sure it was safe, but I also didn't want to stand there feeling helpless. We walked to the edge of the trees. Our flashlights lit up thick trunks and dense undergrowth. We saw no footprints or broken branches. After a few minutes of stumbling around, we heard the faint crack of something deeper in the woods. We turned off our flashlights to see if the lights would reveal themselves again. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I spotted a soft glow flickering among the pines. It seemed to retreat further every time we tried to move closer. Frustration built in me. Connor whispered that it didn't make sense. I agreed. We had no explanation. Eventually the lights disappeared altogether, leaving us in the cold darkness. We retraced our steps back to the tents, both of us tense and on edge. I was wide awake, but I crawled back into my sleeping bag, my mind buzzing. In the small hours, I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion. Morning brought a different atmosphere. The sun revealed the stark expanse of the dried lake bed, a wide bowl of stone and dirt. Connor and I shared a quick breakfast and decided to explore in daylight. We walked around the perimeter, scanning for signs of where water once flowed. We found nothing but scattered rocks, no footprints from the previous night, no scorch marks or anything else that might explain floating lights. The quiet was still there, except for a few distant bird calls. That made me feel a bit calmer. We spent most of the day following a trail leading up a rocky slope. The view from the top was impressive. We saw the patch of forest where the lights had vanished. From up there, it looked dense, with no visible paths. My anxiety from the previous night returned. I could almost feel a knot in my stomach just looking at those tall pines. We returned to camp by late afternoon and considered leaving early, but we'd come all this way to camp. Connor suggested we stay one more night, see if the lights returned, and maybe capture them on camera. I had my phone, but there was little signal out there. We figured we could still record footage if anything happened again. We set up a small dinner of canned soup and protein bars. The sun went down behind the trees, and the temperature dropped. We sat on folding chairs, sipping hot drinks, trying to act casual, but our nerves were high. I kept scanning the tree line, waiting for any flicker. Around 9 p.m., we saw faint glimmers again, moving among the trunks in a slow, erratic pattern. My chest tightened. Connor tried to take pictures on his phone, but every shot turned out blurry. I pulled out my own phone and recorded some video. When we played it back, we just saw shaky orbs of light that looked more like smudges. We decided to approach them cautiously. This time we stayed quiet, stepping carefully over rocks and brush. The closer we got, the more the lights seemed to drift away. It felt like they were leading us into the forest. I kept glancing back at our camp, making sure we could see the glow of our fire as a reference point. My heart pounded, and I felt sweat on my neck despite the cold air. After about 10 minutes, we realized we were fairly deep among the trees, and the lights had vanished. The forest was completely silent. I couldn't see any path, just dark trunks all around. My breath sounded loud in my own ears. Connor whispered that we should head back. I agreed, feeling uneasy. We managed to find our way back to the campfire. The dryness of the lake bed and the night air made every crunch of gravel sound magnified. Around midnight, I woke again to a flash through my tent. I unzipped it just in time to see multiple glowing orbs floating over the dry basin, about 100 yards away. There were 3 of them, forming a triangular shape in the air. I called Connor. He scrambled out of his tent, wide-eyed. We stood there, phones in hand, trying to capture any clear footage, but the lights stayed just beyond the bright range of our phone cameras. My breath came out in short gasps as I tried to steady my hands. Suddenly, the 3 lights scattered in different directions, zooming low over the rocks until they vanished behind the tree line. The sudden quiet afterward hit me hard. My pulse throbbed in my temples. We didn't get much sleep. The next morning, both of us felt drained. We broke down our tents quickly. Our curiosity had turned into apprehension. We drove toward the nearest ranger station, which was a small cabin-like building near a main road. The ranger on duty listened politely as we described strange lights. He gave a guarded smile and said, "We get those reports sometimes." He didn't seem eager to elaborate. Connor asked if anyone had identified the lights, and the ranger shook his head. He said people called them lots of things, maybe illusions, natural phenomena, or something else. Nobody had solid evidence or a confirmed explanation. We left feeling unsettled, our minds buzzing with what we'd witnessed. The rest of the drive back to town was quiet. We kept glancing at each other, shaking our heads. I couldn't stop replaying the moment when those lights formed a triangle in the air, hovering without sound. Connor asked me if I thought they were some sort of unexplained aerial phenomenon. I said I didn't know, but the memory made my skin crawl. In the days that followed, we showed the blurry footage to a few friends. They shrugged and said it could be anything, drones, camera glitches, or reflection. But I know what we saw didn't behave like a drone, and there was no hum or mechanical sound. The lights moved silently, with no visible pattern except that they seemed to recede whenever we tried to approach. The feeling of absolute stillness in that place still lingers in my mind. Sometimes Connor and I talk about returning to that spot just to see if we can learn more. But deep down, neither of us wants to face that emptiness again. The memory of standing in the dark, watching those lights float over the stones, still sends a shiver through me. I can't explain it in scientific terms, and I don't have a logical explanation. But I know what I felt, the tension in my muscles, the rushing of my pulse, the sense that we were witnessing something beyond our understanding. For now, I avoid remote areas around Flathead Lake after dark. Even though part of me is curious, the stronger part remembers the silence and those drifting lights. That's enough to keep me away. I'd rather not experience that kind of cold, uneasy feeling ever again. If someone else wants to investigate, that's their choice. Connor and I lived it once. That's enough for me. Moved into apartment 19 in Riverside because it was cheap and close to my new job. I remember feeling excited the day I signed the lease. It was a small unit on the second floor of a modest complex. The building looked a bit run down, but I figured it had character. The hallway was dimly lit, with beige walls and an old carpet that smelled like stale air freshener. I brushed it off, assuming it was part of living somewhere affordable. The first few nights passed without incident. I unpacked and tried to get settled. On the fourth night, I woke up around 2 a.m. and noticed the front door was open a crack. I distinctly remembered locking it before I went to bed. My heart skipped a beat. My fingers trembled as I reached for the baseball bat I kept near my bed. When I checked the hallway, it was empty. I shut the door quickly and locked it again, making sure the deadbolt was secure. I didn't sleep much after that, my thoughts racing with possibilities. Maybe I forgot to lock it. Maybe the lock was faulty. The next day, I called a locksmith. He examined the door, replaced the lock mechanism, and told me everything was fine now. I felt relieved. I went to bed that night confident it wouldn't happen again. But the very next morning, the door was ajar once more. There was no sign of forced entry, no scratch marks, nothing. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I tested the door lock over and over, flipping the latch, turning the knob, confirming it was secure. Over the following week, it kept happening. Sometimes I'd wake up, walk into the living room, and see a thin slice of hallway light shining through the crack of the door. Sometimes it was early morning, other times it was the middle of the night if I got up for a glass of water. Each time, my heart pounded. Each time, I found no explanation. I bought more security measures. I installed a chain lock and a separate sliding latch at the top of the door. That same night, I heard a soft click around 3 a.m. I jumped out of bed, adrenaline surging. I ran to the door and found it partially open again, the chain hanging loose. The new latch was flipped up, like someone had delicately undone it. My arms were shaking as I pulled the door shut. My throat felt dry. I called the police, but they said there was no evidence of a break-in. I insisted that something strange was happening, but they told me to contact the landlord or install a camera. That gave me an idea. The next day, I went to an electronics store and bought a small security camera. I placed it on a shelf facing the front door. I set it to record at night. The first time I reviewed the footage in the morning, my stomach twisted. The video seemed normal up until around 2:47 a.m. Then it froze for a fraction of a second, skipped a few frames, and the next frame showed the door already open. No visible person, no sign of how it happened. The timestamp jumped from 2:47:02 to 2:47:06, missing 4 seconds. My hand tightened on the computer mouse. I replayed it multiple times, pausing, zooming, nothing. It was like those frames just vanished. I felt panic creeping in. I double-checked the memory card and the camera settings. Everything seemed correct. The next night, I tried again, making sure the camera was fully charged and had enough storage. Same result. The footage cut out for a few seconds, and the door was open in the next frame. I couldn't believe it. I started to question my own sanity. I tried asking neighbors if they'd seen anything in the hallway at night. Most of them said no, they slept through the night or worked different shifts. A few gave me strange looks, as if they doubted my story. I felt alone. The landlord insisted no one else had reported issues with their locks. He suggested I might be forgetting to shut it properly, or that maybe I was sleepwalking. The condescending tone in his voice made my hands ball into fists. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I called another locksmith for a second opinion. He installed a new door handle with a more secure deadbolt and tested it thoroughly. He even added a keypad lock at my request. I spent more money than I could afford, but I was desperate. I triple-checked everything that night, flipping each lock, testing the handle. It felt solid. I barricaded the door with a chair wedged under the knob, then pushed a small dresser in front of it as an extra obstacle. Satisfied, I went to bed. I woke up around 5 a.m., drenched in sweat from a nightmare. I shuffled into the living room, blinking in the dim light. My heart sank. The door was open, the chair moved aside, and the dresser shifted just enough for the door to swing open. My limbs felt numb, and my stomach churned. The locks were still engaged, but the door was wide open. I felt my knees go weak. My lungs tightened as I walked over to push everything back into place. I thought about calling my family, but they lived out of state. I didn't want to worry them, and I wasn't even sure how to explain it. At this point, I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. I started sleeping on the couch, facing the door. I figured if I stayed awake, maybe I could witness what was happening. The first night I tried it, I sat there with a baseball bat across my lap, eyes glued to the door. Around 2 a.m., a wave of exhaustion hit me. My eyelids got heavy, my head nodded. No matter how hard I fought it, I kept drifting off. I jerked awake multiple times, trying to stay conscious. Eventually, I must have passed out. When I snapped awake at 4 a.m., the door was open again. My body shivered with a cold sweat. It felt like something was deliberately forcing me to sleep. I started drinking coffee, energy drinks, anything to keep me awake during that window. But every single time, at some point in the night, I'd black out or find myself half-conscious, then wake to see the door open. My panic escalated. My chest often felt tight, and my heart raced. I hardly ate. I constantly looked over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching me. Yet, the hallway camera outside showed no one coming in or out. The building's main entrance never recorded any suspicious activity. It felt impossible. Desperate, I borrowed a second camera from a friend. I aimed it from another angle, hoping if the first camera skipped frames, the second one might catch something. Night came. I set everything to record, made sure the memory cards were empty, and drank a giant cup of coffee. Same routine. Around 3 a.m., I felt a sudden drowsiness, like my eyes were weighed down by bricks. I fought it as best as I could, but my vision blurred. The next thing I knew, it was 5:30 a.m., and the door was open once more. When I checked the recordings, both cameras had the same glitchy gap. A few seconds missing, then the door was open. My mind reeled. I had no rational explanation. I started feeling like my apartment actively resisted being locked. I called the landlord, told him I wanted out of the lease. He reminded me of the contract terms, that I'd lose my deposit and maybe owe extra fees. I didn't care. I wanted out. I began packing my belongings in a frantic rush. I taped up boxes without sorting. Each time I opened a cupboard or closet, I felt an urge to hurry. My hands shook as I folded clothes. My shoulders ached with tension. I kept the front door closed during the day, checking it every few minutes, relieved to see it stay shut in the daylight. But I dreaded the night. My mouth felt constantly dry, and my stomach churned at the idea of another encounter. On my final night, I decided to sleep at a friend's place and return in the morning to grab the last boxes. Before leaving, I walked through the apartment, making sure I wasn't missing anything important. I paused at the front door for a second, thinking about how much money and time I'd sunk into this place. I turned the deadbolt, the chain, and the latch one last time, each click echoing in the empty living room. Then I left, taking a small suitcase with me. Early the next day, I arrived with a taxi to move the remaining items. The hallway felt as dreary as ever. I walked up the stairs, approached apartment 19, and found the door wide open. My heart pounded. I stepped inside. The place felt colder than usual. Dust motes floated in the sunlight. I glanced around, making sure none of my stuff was stolen. Everything seemed to be there, aside from a couple of boxes I'd already taken. I collected the last of my belongings as quickly as I could, stuffing them into bags and crates. When I was done, I paused at the threshold. I looked back at the empty living room, remembering all the nights I'd sat there, desperately trying to keep the door closed. A chill ran over my arms. Something about that space felt like it was breathing on its own. I stepped into the hallway and let the door drift shut. My hands felt clammy as I forced the key into the lock and turned it. I didn't wait to see if it stayed locked. I didn't want to know. On my way out, I handed the key to the landlord's office and told the woman at the desk that I was officially done. She barely acknowledged me. I walked out of the building with my last box in hand, loaded it into the taxi, and sank into the back seat. My entire body trembled with relief and nerves. The cab driver asked if I was okay. I just nodded, unable to form a proper sentence. I felt like I'd escaped something I couldn't explain. To this day, I can't fully process what happened in apartment 19. Part of me thinks there was a rational cause I never discovered, maybe a bizarre malfunction in the door or frame. Another part of me suspects there was something else at play, something that didn't like to be locked in. I don't have the answer. All I know is that I'm never going back. Even recalling it now makes my chest tighten. I've found a new place across town, and I sleep better. I still lock my door every night, checking it 2 or 3 times, but I no longer wake to find it open. That's all I wanted, a simple sense of security, which apartment 19 refused to give. I never used to believe the rumors about Redfield High School. Students whispered about shadows in the disused wing, and some even claimed to see figures at night. I considered it typical high school gossip, nothing more. The old building was in poor shape, with half of it closed off due to budget cuts. Still, it was our high school, and I spent 4 years walking its halls without seeing anything out of the ordinary. That changed one night when I stayed late to lock up the gym. It happened toward the end of my senior year. Our basketball team had hosted a fundraiser game for local charities. The coach asked me to help pack up and secure the doors because I was a member of the student council. By the time the last people left, it was nearly 10 o'clock. I turned off the overhead lights in the gym, leaving the place dimly lit by exit signs. The echoes of dribbling and cheering still lingered in my mind, but the space felt empty and cold. I walked through the main hallway that connected the gym to the rest of the school. The dull fluorescent lights flickered every now and then. My footsteps made a hollow sound on the worn linoleum. As I reached the doors leading out to the parking lot, I decided to do one final check. It was a habit I'd picked up from the custodian, who always said never to leave a door unlocked overnight. I went back to the gym entrance, tested the doors, and confirmed they were locked. Then I stepped into the corridor leading to the old wing. That section was supposed to be closed and locked at all times, but I spotted a small glow under the door window. I felt a chill. The old wing had no reason to have lights on. It was a zone of broken lockers, peeling paint, and dusty classrooms. They shut it down years ago. The only person who had a key to that area was the head custodian, or so I thought. I approached the door slowly. My sneakers scuffed the floor, and the sound echoed in the silent hallway. My stomach felt tense, and the hair on my arms prickled. I peered through the narrow window. The corridor beyond was dim, lit only by a single overhead lamp that flickered. I heard footsteps. They were soft and deliberate, coming from deep in that wing. My first thought was that maybe the custodian was still inside, but something about those footsteps made my chest tighten. They didn't sound like normal steps. They were too slow, too drawn out. I tried the handle. Locked. I tapped on the glass. "Hello? Anyone there?" The footsteps stopped. Silence. My pulse thumped in my neck. I felt a sudden urge to leave, but my curiosity pushed me to at least confirm no one was wandering around. I considered my options. Then I remembered the side door leading into the old wing near the cafeteria. Sometimes the latch didn't close properly. If that door was open, someone might have gotten inside. I made my way to that side door. The entire school felt strangely still. The hallway lights buzzed faintly. My breathing sounded too loud in my ears. When I arrived at the side door, I found it unlocked. My heart sank. I stepped inside. The old wing's hallway smelled of musty air and something else I couldn't identify. The floor was covered with dust, except for some scuff marks that looked recent. My hand gripped my phone, ready to turn on its flashlight or call for help if needed. I walked down the corridor, checking the empty classrooms. Most doors were boarded up, but a few still had open windows. The only light came from a single flickering fixture at the far end. My skin tingled, and my stomach felt tight. I kept thinking about the footsteps I'd heard. The quiet weighed on me. In the dim glow, I could see broken chairs stacked against a wall, a row of old lockers with rusted edges, and water-stained ceiling tiles. That's when I saw a flicker of movement at the end of the corridor. It was like a shadow shifting from one side of the hall to the other. I stopped and held my breath. I stared, trying to see clearly. The overhead light blinked, and I couldn't make out details. But I was sure I'd seen something. I took a few slow steps forward, my pulse pounding. Then the light flickered again. I caught a glimpse of a long shadow stretching across the floor. When the light steadied, the shadow was gone. My chest felt tight. I stood there, uncertain whether to keep going. I reminded myself it could be the custodian, but that didn't explain why he wouldn't answer me. My eyes darted around for any sign of a person, but I saw only the leftover furniture and debris. I decided to call out again. "Hello? Whoever's here, you shouldn't be. School is closed." My voice echoed. No answer. I forced myself to move forward, searching each open classroom. I found nothing but dusty desks and some old textbooks. The tension in my body grew. My legs felt shaky. As I passed one particular room, I noticed the overhead lights inside flickering. The door was ajar, so I nudged it open. My stomach flipped when I saw a shape in the corner, like a tall silhouette near the chalkboard. I froze, blinking hard. The light blinked twice, then steadied, revealing an empty corner. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I backed out of that room, heart thudding. I decided enough was enough. I turned around to go back the way I came. Then I heard something scrape against the floor behind me like a chair leg dragging. The corridor lights blinked again. My breath caught. I spun around. Nothing. I felt sweat on the back of my neck. My hand trembled as I shone my phone's flashlight around. The beam shook, making everything look jittery. I hurried toward the exit, ignoring every creeping sensation. My mind raced with fear. Then, at the threshold, I saw the overhead lights flicker one more time. In that instant, I glimpsed a dark figure at the far end of the hallway. It looked like it stood upright, possibly human-shaped, though I couldn't see features. It slithered backward, disappearing into a classroom. My heart pounded so hard that my vision blurred for a moment. I rushed out the door, pulling it shut behind me. I locked it, practically stumbling as I ran down the hall toward the main exit. Outside, the cool night air hit my face, and I realized I was trembling. My hands shook, my breathing was ragged. I felt a rush of relief just being away from that corridor. I hopped into my car and drove home, trying not to look back. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the moment I saw that shape vanish. My mind refused to settle. I told myself it might have been a shadow cast by a passing car, or a trick of the flickering light, but my gut told me that corridor had something else in it. The next day, I talked to the school's custodian, Mrs. Lang, about it. She admitted that odd things happened in that old wing. She mentioned hearing footsteps, doors shutting on their own, and lights flickering for no electrical reason. She even heard rumors of a tragedy that happened decades ago, though she didn't go into details. I felt a chill, realizing that the stories might be based on real events. She advised me to avoid going there at night. I didn't argue. Despite her warning, I got curious. A few days later, I convinced a friend to explore the old wing with me after school. We decided to see if we could film something. We brought flashlights and a cheap camcorder. School ended, and we sneaked into the closed corridor around 5 p.m. before the custodian did her final rounds. We walked through the same halls, filming corners and ceilings. It felt less intimidating in daylight, but the place still exuded a heavy atmosphere. The floors creaked under our steps. Our voices echoed strangely. We poked into a few classrooms, scanning with our camera. Everything was still. After nearly half an hour, we found nothing unusual. Disappointed, we decided to leave. As we headed to the exit, my friend paused, pointing at a door with a small window in it. He thought he saw a shadow move inside. We raised the camera. The window was dusty, so we could barely see. We opened the door and found a utility closet. It was cramped and smelled of mildew. There was nothing there but a shelf of old cleaning supplies. My friend joked that we were spooking ourselves, so we laughed nervously and left. When we got home, we tried to watch the footage. The files were corrupted. The camera had shut off several times without warning. Most of what we filmed was static or glitchy. Our attempts to see anything unusual failed. The only clear shot we had was of an empty classroom. My friend shrugged it off, but I felt uneasy. Technology problems in that area seemed too coincidental. Over the next few weeks, other students mentioned hearing strange noises at night during late practices or events. One friend swore she saw a black shape cross the hallway and vanish. Another claimed a classroom door slammed shut behind him when he was retrieving sports equipment. The administration shrugged off these reports. They had no budget to investigate or renovate the old wing, so they kept it sealed. The final strange event I experienced happened near graduation. I was tasked with helping set up chairs in the gym for the ceremony. It was late afternoon. I went to grab a cart of folding chairs from a storage closet near the old wing entrance. The door had a window facing that corridor. I happened to glance through. I saw a tall shadow slide along the far wall as if it was pacing. Then it seemed to flatten against the wall and disappear. I felt my blood run cold. I remember my arms feeling limp as I dragged the cart away, heart beating too fast. I didn't tell anyone. I just wanted to graduate and leave that school behind. After graduation, I heard the director decided to officially block off the old wing with new locks and barricades. They wanted to prevent students from entering. No one admitted there was anything supernatural about it. They framed it as a safety issue related to structural concerns. I moved away for college and tried to forget that place. Occasionally, I'd recall the flickering lights or that moment I saw the shape at the end of the corridor. My chest would tighten, and I'd feel that same tingling on my neck. Even now, when I think of Redfield High School, I remember the normal side, the classrooms, the gym, the cafeteria, and then I recall the shut-down corridor with its peeling paint and that tall, dark figure. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was some leftover imprint from the building's past. Maybe it was a person who wasn't supposed to be there. Whatever the case, I learned not to dismiss strange stories so quickly. When someone says a place has shadows moving at night, I pay attention. I remember how real my own fear felt in those silent, flickering halls. And I remember how grateful I was to leave that old building for good.